Welcome, weary soul, to a journey through the ages of fire and darkness. Tonight, we venture into the timeless realm of Lordran and beyond, where ancient gods once walked among mortals and mighty dragons ruled the skies. This is a tale that spans millennia, from the birth of disparity itself to the final flickering of flame. Here, in this place between sleep and waking, we'll traverse the rise and fall of kingdoms, witness the tragic heroism of chosen undead, and explore the cyclical nature of light and shadow. So settle into comfort, let your breathing slow, and prepare to walk through the fog gates of legend. Close your eyes when ready, and let the ancient stories carry you into peaceful rest. In the beginning, there was nothing. No light, no warmth, no meaning to distinguish one moment from another. The world existed in a state of perfect, unchanging grey, shrouded by endless fog that rolled between the towering arch trees like the breath of some sleeping giant. This was the Age of Ancients, a time before time, when the very concept of difference had no place in the unformed reality that stretched beyond all horizons. In this twilight realm, the everlasting dragons held dominion over all that was and all that would ever be. These magnificent beings were not rulers in any sense we might understand, for there was nothing to rule, no subjects to command, no kingdoms to govern. They simply were, as constant and immutable as the grey crags that pierced the mists, as eternal as the stone scales that covered their ancient forms. The dragons knew neither death nor birth, neither joy nor sorrow, for such concepts belonged to a world of change, and change was yet unknown. The arch trees stretched upward into the endless fog, their massive trunks supporting platforms of stone where the dragons made their roosts. These trees were not alive as we understand life, for they required no nourishment, felt no seasons, experienced no growth or decay. They existed in the same state of eternal stasis as everything else in this primordial world, monuments to a time when permanence was the only law, and variation was inconceivable. Time itself had no meaning in this age, for there was nothing to measure, no events to mark one moment as different from another. The fog rolled and swirled in patterns that had remained unchanged for eons, and would continue unchanged for eons more. The dragons soared through the mists on journeys without purpose, their great wings beating in rhythms that echoed endlessly through the silence. It was a world of perfect peace, perfect stillness, perfect emptiness. But even in the most changeless of ages, even in the deepest stasis, the seeds of transformation lie dormant, waiting for the proper moment to bloom. And so it was that one day, in this realm where days had no meaning, something unprecedented occurred. Deep beneath the grey earth, in places where even the ancient dragons did not venture, a light began to kindle. It was small at first, barely more than a spark, but in a world that had known only uniformity, even the tiniest deviation was revolutionary. Fire, the first flame, born from nothing, emerging from emptiness like a star being born in the void. With its appearance came something the world had never known: disparity, light and dark, heat and cold, life and death, all the countless divisions that would define existence from that moment forward. The flame burned with a light that was more than illumination, a heat that was more than warmth. It was potential itself, the possibility of change made manifest. The appearance of the first flame marked the end of the grey twilight that had defined all existence. As its light spread through the ancient realm, the fog began to recede, revealing landscapes that had been hidden since the dawn of time. The perfect uniformity of the Age of Ancients began to fracture, creating spaces where new forms of existence might take root. and from the darkness that the flame's light created by its very presence, the first humanoid beings emerged, drawn by the promise of something greater than eternal sameness. These early beings, hollow and indistinct, wandered through the transformed landscape like children taking their first steps. They moved through the receding mists with wonder and uncertainty, their newly awakened consciousness struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had changed. The world that had seemed so permanent, so unchangeable, was revealing itself to be malleable, full of possibilities that had never before existed. As these hollow beings drew closer to the source of the great change, they discovered that the first flame contained within its dancing light something miraculous. Souls, not the simple animating force that moves the body, but true souls, concentrated essence of the flame itself. These souls glowed with power and purpose, each one a fragment of the divine fire that had shattered the age of stasis. 4 of these souls burned brighter than all the others. 4 Lord souls that contained within them the power to reshape reality itself. The first of these mighty souls was claimed by a being who would become known as Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight. This soul blazed with the fierce radiance of lightning, containing within its essence the power of light itself. Gwyn's soul granted him dominion over the forces that would drive back the darkness, making him a beacon of illumination in a world learning to distinguish between light and shadow. With this power came a terrible responsibility, for he would become the architect of the age that was to come. The second Lord's soul was taken by the being called Nito, who would become the first of the dead. His soul carried within it the concept of ending, the necessity of death that gives meaning to life. Where Gwyn's soul blazed with creative force, Nito's burned with the quiet flame of conclusion, the understanding that all things must eventually come to rest. This was not a cruel power, but a necessary one, for without ending, there can be no new beginning. The third Lord Soul fell to the Witch of Izalith, whose essence became entwined with the primal forces of flame and creation. Her soul contained the knowledge of how to nurture and guide fire, how to coax it into new forms and shapes. She would become the mother of new flames, the one who understood better than any other how the first flame might be preserved and propagated. Her daughters would inherit this knowledge, becoming keepers of sacred fires throughout the realm. But there was a fourth soul, different from the others, easily overlooked in the brightness of its companions. This was the Dark Soul, found by a small, seemingly insignificant being known only as the Furtive Pygmy. Unlike the other Lord Souls, which blazed with obvious power, the Dark Soul was subtle, its strength hidden in shadow and silence. It was easily forgotten, dismissed as less important than the dramatic might of its fellow souls. But within its quiet depths lay a power that would prove to be the most significant of all. The Dark Soul was unique among the Lord Souls because it was not complete. While Gwyn's lightning, Nito's death, and the Witch's flame were whole unto themselves, the Dark Soul was fragmented, its essence scattered among all of humanity. Every human being carried within them a fragment of this original soul, a piece of the primordial darkness that had existed before the first flame brought light to the world. This made humanity fundamentally different from the gods who wielded the other Lord Souls, for while the gods drew their power from single, concentrated sources, humanity's strength was distributed, collective, and endlessly renewable. With the Lord Souls claimed and their power beginning to manifest, the new lords found themselves in a world still dominated by the ancient dragons. These primordial beings, symbols of the unchanging age that had just ended, represented everything the lords sought to move beyond: the dragons' immortality, their resistance to change, their perfect adaptation to the grey world of stasis, all of this marked them as obstacles to the new age of fire and transformation. Gwyn, now bearing the title of Lord of Sunlight, looked upon the dragons not with hatred, but with the cold calculation of necessity. They were beautiful, magnificent, powerful beyond measure, but they belonged to the old world, the grey world, the world without meaning or growth. If the new age was to flourish, if the potential contained within the first flame was to be realized, the dragons would have to fall. It was not personal, merely inevitable, like the turning of seasons or the passage of time itself. The furtive pygmy and his followers, those early humans who carried fragments of the dark soul, were approached by Gwyn with an offer of alliance. Their strange, dark power intrigued him, and he recognized that their unique nature might prove valuable in the coming conflict. The humans, eager to prove their worth in this new world, agreed to join the war against the dragons. Their weapons and armor were forged in the depths of the abyss, that place of primordial darkness where the power of the dark soul was strongest. But Gwyn's alliance with humanity was born from necessity rather than trust. The dark power that humans wielded frightened him, reminding him too much of the grey twilight from which they had all emerged. He feared that this darkness might grow to overwhelm the light he sought to establish, might drag the world back into the unchanging stasis of the Age of Ancients. And so, even as he accepted their aid, he took precautions, placing seals of fire upon their weapons and armor to contain their power and prevent it from spreading beyond his control. The war against the dragons began not with grand declarations or formal challenges, but with quiet preparation and careful strategy. Gwyn and his fellow lords understood that brute force alone would not be sufficient to overcome beings who had survived unchanged since the beginning of time. The dragon's stone scales made them virtually invulnerable to conventional weapons, and their mastery of the ancient world gave them advantages that the lords could only begin to understand. For every dragon that fell to the forces of the lords, 70 of their own perished. The ancient beings fought with the fury of those defending their very existence, and their power was terrible to behold. Dragonfire could reduce entire armies to ash, their claws could shatter the strongest armor, and their wings could summon storms that blotted out the sun. The war stretched on far longer than Gwyn had anticipated, and there were moments when it seemed that the Age of Ancients might reassert itself through sheer force of will. But the dragons had a weakness, one that would ultimately prove their undoing. Their immortality, their perfect resistance to change, depended upon their stone scales, those grey plates that covered their forms like living armor. The scales were not merely protection, but the very source of their eternal nature, channels through which the power of the ancient world flowed into their bodies. If those scales could be stripped away, the dragons would become mortal, vulnerable to the forces of the new age. This crucial secret was revealed through betrayal, as is so often the case in tales of great change. Seath the Scaleless, born different from his brethren, lacking the stone scales that granted immortality, harbored a deep resentment toward his own kind. He had spent eons watching his fellow dragons enjoy the eternal existence that was denied to him, and when the lords offered him a chance for revenge, he seized it eagerly. In exchange for the secret of the scales, Seath would be granted a place in the new order, a duchy among the gods, and a fragment of Gwyn's own soul to sustain him. Armed with this knowledge, Gwyn took upon himself the mantle of the Lord of Sunlight in its truest sense. He and his knights learned to harness the power of lightning, channeling the fierce energy of storms through their weapons and their very beings. Lightning, that force which splits the sky and illuminates the darkness, proved to be the perfect weapon against the dragon's stone scales. The electrical force could penetrate their defenses, peel back their protection and expose the vulnerable flesh beneath. The tide of war turned with dramatic swiftness once this technique was mastered. Dragon after dragon fell to the lightning of Gwyn's forces, their immortal forms reduced to mortal flesh that could be burned by flame and pierced by blade. The ancient roosts among the arch trees were stormed and taken, their draconic inhabitants either slain or driven into hiding. The Age of Ancients, which had seemed so permanent, so unchangeable, crumbled before the advancing forces of fire and lightning. The few dragons that survived this great purge fled to the far corners of the world, seeking places where they might hide from the wrath of the new lords. Some retreated to the depths of ash-covered valleys, others to remote peaks where the mists still lingered, and still others to caverns deep beneath the earth, where the old ways might yet endure. They would become legends, remembered in whispered tales and half-forgotten songs, symbols of a world that had passed into memory. With the dragons defeated and the old order overthrown, the Age of Fire could truly begin. Gwyn, victorious but not ungrateful, honored his promise to Seath the Scaleless, granting him the title of Duke and establishing him in the Grand Archives where he might pursue his research into the immortality that had been denied him by birth. But this act of apparent generosity carried within it the seeds of future tragedy, for Seath's obsession with eternal life would eventually consume him, driving him to madness and corruption. The world that emerged from the ashes of the Age of Ancients was bright and full of promise. The grey fog that had shrouded everything was burned away by the light of the first flame, revealing landscapes of stunning beauty and infinite possibility. Rivers flowed where once there had been only still mists. Forests grew where arch trees had stood in eternal silence. And across all of this new realm, life began to flourish in forms that the ancient world had never imagined. But even in this moment of triumph, even as the lords celebrated their victory and looked forward to the golden age that was to come, the seeds of future conflict were already taking root. The power of the dark soul, contained but not destroyed, would continue to grow within humanity. The defeated dragons would not remain hidden forever, and new challenges would arise to test the strength of the Age of Fire. The first flame that had brought such wonderful change to the world would not burn forever, and when it began to fade, those who had built their kingdom upon its light would face choices that would echo through all the ages to come. From the ashes of the ancient world, Lord Gwyn set about creating something magnificent beyond imagination. High above the earthbound realm, where clouds gathered like cotton and sunlight poured down in golden streams, he raised the glorious city of Anorlondo. This was to be the seat of divine power, a city of silver and gold that would stand as testament to the triumph of light over the grey stasis of ages past. The very architecture seemed to sing with divine purpose, its soaring spires and graceful arches reaching toward the heavens like prayers made manifest in stone and metal. Anorlondo was not merely a city, but a statement of intent, a declaration that the Age of Fire would be one of beauty, order, and eternal prosperity. The buildings rose in harmonious proportions that pleased the eye and lifted the spirit, their surfaces gleaming with a light that seemed to come from within the stone itself. Grand staircases swept upward in elegant curves, connecting levels of the city with a grace that made even the simple act of walking feel like a dance. Every window was positioned to capture the perfect amount of sunlight, every courtyard designed to create spaces where the divine residents might gather in comfort and splendor. In this celestial realm, Gwyn established his court and welcomed those who had aided him in the great war against the dragons. The gods who had chosen to remain loyal to the new order were granted places of honor within the Silver City, their own palaces and domains where they might exercise their divine authority. These were beings of immense power and wisdom, each one a master of forces that mortal minds could scarcely comprehend. Yet they moved through Anor Londo's halls with the easy familiarity of old friends gathering in a beloved home. The city's greatest marvel was perhaps the cathedral that housed the central bonfire, a structure so vast and awe-inspiring that it seemed capable of holding the entire sky within its vaulted ceiling. Here, the light of the first flame was concentrated and magnified, creating a perpetual dawn that bathed everything in warm golden radiance. The floors were polished to mirror brightness, reflecting the dancing flames in patterns that shifted like living things. Pillars of white stone rose toward the heights, carved with intricate reliefs that told the story of the gods' victory and the promise of eternal prosperity that victory had secured. Within this paradise of light and order, Gwyn's family found their proper places in the divine hierarchy. His firstborn son, whose name would later be stripped from history for reasons lost to time, was granted dominion over war and martial prowess. This prince of the gods embodied the noble aspects of conflict, the courage and honor that had won the war against the dragons. And under his guidance, the divine armies maintained their strength and readiness. His very presence was a reminder that the peace of Anor Londo had been won through strength of arms, and would be maintained by the same means if necessary. Guinevere, Gwyn's eldest daughter, became the embodiment of sunlight itself, her radiance complementing her father's divine flame. She was beauty incarnate, kindness made manifest, the gentle warmth that made the harsh light of the sun bearable to mortal eyes. In her presence, the glory of Anor Londo seemed not intimidating but welcoming, not distant but accessible. She became the face that the gods showed to the world below, the promise that divine power could be benevolent, and that the age of fire would bring blessings to all who embraced its light. But it was Gwyn's youngest child who would prove most crucial to the long-term stability of the divine order. Gwendolyn, born under the light of the moon rather than the sun, possessed an affinity for illusion and subtle manipulation that complemented his father's more direct approach to governance. Though raised as a daughter due to his connection to lunar forces, Gwendolyn's true gift lay in his ability to maintain the stability of Anor Londo through careful management of perception and reality. He understood that power rested not only on strength, but on the willingness of others to believe in that strength. The Dark Moon Covenant that Gwendolyn established served as both a religious organization and a tool of divine justice. Those who swore allegiance to the Dark Sun were bound to hunt down those who had transgressed against the gods, ensuring that divine law was respected even in the furthest corners of the realm. These covenant members moved through the world like shadows, appearing wherever divine justice needed to be dispensed, their presence a reminder that the gods' reach extended far beyond the silver spires of Anor Londo. Among the most celebrated residents of the Divine City were Gwyn's 4 knights, the greatest warriors of the Age of Fire and the embodiment of different aspects of divine martial prowess. These champions had proven themselves in the war against the dragons and continued to serve as both protectors of Anor Londo and symbols of the order that Gwyn sought to establish throughout the realm. Each knight represented a different approach to the challenges that faced the New Age, and together they formed a fellowship that seemed capable of overcoming any obstacle. Knight Artorius, the Abyss Walker, stood as perhaps the most celebrated of these champions, a warrior whose courage and skill had become legendary even among the gods. His great sword and his loyal wolf companion, Sif, were known throughout the realm, symbols of the righteous fury that had driven back the forces of darkness. Artorius embodied the ideal of the noble knight, combining incredible martial prowess with an unwavering commitment to protecting the innocent. His very name became synonymous with heroism, and songs of his deeds were sung in halls both divine and mortal. Dragonslayer Ornstein commanded the Silver Knights, who served as Anor Londo's primary military force, his golden armor gleaming like a second sun as he moved through the city's halls. His mastery of lightning, learned from Gwyn himself, made him a formidable opponent to any who might threaten the Divine Order. But beyond his martial skills, Ornstein possessed the rare ability to inspire others, to kindle in ordinary warriors the spark of greatness that could transform them into true champions. Under his guidance, the Silver Knights became more than mere soldiers. They became an embodiment of divine will, made manifest in the mortal realm. Hawkeye Goff, the giant archer whose arrows could bring down dragons in flight, represented the patient, methodical aspect of divine warfare. From his position high in the towers of Anor Londo, he watched over the approaches to the city with eyes that could spot threats from impossible distances. His great bow was a marvel of craftsmanship, capable of launching projectiles with such force and precision that they could pierce even the strongest armor. But Goff's true strength lay not in his physical prowess, but in his wisdom, the deep understanding of strategy and tactics that made him invaluable as both warrior and counselor. The fourth knight, Lord's Blade Ciaran, moved through the shadows of Anor Londo like a whisper of death, her twin curved swords ready to eliminate threats before they could fully manifest. She was the hand of divine justice in its most subtle form, dealing with problems that required finesse rather than overwhelming force. Her loyalty to Artorias was known throughout the city, and some whispered that she harbored feelings for the great knight that went beyond mere comradeship in arms. Whether or not these rumors held truth, her dedication to protecting both Artorias and the divine order he served was absolute and unwavering. Beyond the city's walls, the realm prospered under divine guidance. The light of the first flame encouraged growth and creativity in all their forms, and civilizations began to flourish in ways that the grey world of the ancients had never allowed. Humans, in particular, seemed to thrive in this new age, their fragments of the dark soul providing them with an adaptability and resilience that served them well in the changing world. They built cities and kingdoms, developed arts and sciences, and gradually began to understand their place in the grand design that the gods had established. Yet even as he created this golden age, Gwyn remained troubled by questions that had no easy answers. The power of the dark soul continued to grow within humanity, and he could see that this strength, if left unchecked, might eventually challenge the supremacy of the gods themselves. The darkness was not evil, precisely, but it was chaotic, unpredictable, difficult to control. It represented a return to the variability and change that had characterized the end of the Age of Ancients, and Gwyn feared that too much change might destabilize everything he had worked to build. His solution was characteristically direct, but also deeply troubling in its implications. Far from Anor Londo, at the very edge of the world itself, Gwyn created the Ringed City, a beautiful prison disguised as a gift. To this remote location, he sent the descendants of the furtive pygmy, granting them grand titles and honors while simultaneously ensuring that their dark power would remain safely contained at the world's end. The city was magnificent, its architecture rivaling even Anor Londo in its beauty, but its true purpose was to serve as a cage for humanity's growing strength. To ensure the cooperation of the pygmy lords who ruled this distant city, Gwyn made a gesture that seemed generous but carried within it the seeds of future tragedy. He sent his youngest daughter, Filianor, to serve as both princess and guardian of the Ringed City, her presence a symbol of the bond between gods and humanity, while also serving as a living seal that would maintain the separation between light and dark. Filianor accepted this duty with the grace that befitted a daughter of gods, but in doing so, she condemned herself to an existence of eternal vigilance, forever watching over the dark soul's power, while never being able to return to her father's golden city. The establishment of the Way of White provided Gwyn with another tool for managing the growing complexity of the Age of Fire. This religious organization, ostensibly dedicated to the preservation of the flame and the worship of the gods, served multiple purposes in the divine hierarchy. On its surface, it was indeed a faith that encouraged mortals to embrace the light and reject the darkness. But its deeper function was to create a network of influence and control that extended throughout the mortal realm. The Way of White taught that the linking of the fire was the highest possible good, the action that preserved the world from falling into the dark chaos that had preceded the Age of Fire. Its clerics and missionaries spread this message far and wide, establishing temples and shrines where mortals could come to worship the light and receive the blessings that such devotion was said to bring. The organization provided structure and purpose to mortal lives while simultaneously ensuring that divine authority was respected and maintained. Through the Way of White, the gods could monitor the spiritual health of the mortal realm, identifying potential threats to the established order before they could grow too powerful. The faith's emphasis on the dangers of darkness served to make humanity wary of their own inner nature, encouraging them to suppress the very qualities that made them unique among the world's inhabitants. It was a masterpiece of subtle control, achieving divine objectives while appearing to serve mortal interests. As the centuries passed in what seemed like endless prosperity, Gwyn began to notice disturbing signs that the Age of Fire might not be as eternal as he had hoped. The first flame, that miraculous source of light and disparity that had made the new world possible, showed subtle but unmistakable signs of diminishment. Its light, though still brilliant, lacked the fierce intensity of earlier days. Its heat, though still warm, no longer possessed the overwhelming power that had driven back the grey fog of the ancient world. These changes were gradual, so slow that they might have gone unnoticed by less perceptive observers. But Gwyn had built his entire existence around the flame's power, and he could sense its subtle alterations like a musician detecting a single false note in an otherwise perfect symphony. The realization that the flame might fade filled him with a dread that went beyond personal fear, for he understood that if the light failed, everything he had built would crumble into the darkness that had preceded it. The fading of the flame carried implications that extended far beyond the mere dimming of light. As the fire's power waned, the careful balance that maintained the Age of Fire began to shift in ways that threatened the entire structure of divine rule. The seals that contained dangerous forces started to weaken. The barriers that separated order from chaos began to show cracks. And most troubling of all, the dark power that resided within humanity began to stir with renewed vigor. Seath the Scaleless, the albino dragon who had betrayed his own kind to secure a place among the gods, had spent his centuries in the Duke's archives pursuing the immortality that had been denied to him by his lack of scales. His research into the nature of souls and crystals had yielded remarkable insights into the fundamental forces that governed existence, but it had also gradually consumed his sanity. The pursuit of eternal life had become an obsession that dominated every aspect of his being, driving him to experiments that grew increasingly desperate and morally questionable. In the crystalline caves beneath his archives, Seath conducted studies that would have horrified even his former draconic brethren. He learned to grow crystal formations that could preserve life indefinitely, but at the cost of transforming living beings into mindless, hollow shells. His research into the nature of souls led him to capture and experiment on countless subjects, seeking to understand the secrets of immortality through the suffering of others. The pale dragon, who had once seemed a valuable ally to the gods, had become a monster whose hunger for knowledge knew no moral bounds. The grand archives that Gwyn had built for Seath became a repository of forbidden knowledge, its halls lined with tomes and scrolls that contained insights into the darkest aspects of existence. Students came from across the realm to study in these halls, drawn by the promise of wisdom and power, but few who entered Seath's domain remained unchanged by the experience. The pursuit of knowledge, when divorced from wisdom and compassion, had created a place where learning itself had become a form of corruption. As the flame continued its slow decline, other signs of instability began to manifest throughout the realm. The Silver Knights, who had once stood as perfect examples of divine order, began to show signs of wear and weariness. Their armor, though still bright, no longer gleamed with the inner light that had once made them seem like beings of pure illumination. Their movements, though still precise, lacked the fluid grace that had once marked them as supernatural guardians. In the mortal realm, the effects of the flame's weakening were even more pronounced. Kingdoms that had flourished under divine protection began to experience internal strife and external pressures. The unity that had characterized the early centuries of the Age of Fire gave way to division and conflict as different groups competed for dwindling resources and questioned the divine authority that had once seemed unshakable. The Way of White, which had served so effectively as a tool of divine control, began to fragment as different interpretations of doctrine emerged. Some clerics preached that the weakness of the flame was a test of faith that could be overcome through greater devotion and sacrifice. Others argued that the gods had abandoned the world and that mortals must find their own path to salvation. Still, others whispered that the darkness which the faith had taught them to fear might actually offer a better alternative to the failing light. Gwyn watched these developments with growing alarm, recognizing in them the signs of a crisis that threatened to destroy everything he had worked to create. The Age of Fire, which had seemed so stable and eternal during its golden centuries, was revealing itself to be just another phase in the cosmic cycle, destined to end just as the Age of Ancients had ended before it. The question that tormented the Lord of Sunlight was whether this ending could be prevented, or whether it was simply the natural progression of forces too large and fundamental to be resisted. In the depths of his divine wisdom, Gwyn began to contemplate actions that would have seemed unthinkable during the height of his power. If the flame could not burn forever on its own strength, perhaps it could be sustained through deliberate sacrifice. If the Age of Fire was destined to end naturally, perhaps its ending could be postponed through supernatural intervention. These thoughts marked the beginning of a desperate struggle that would define not only Gwyn's own fate, but the destiny of every soul that inhabited the realm he had created. The Golden Age of Anor Londo, with all its beauty and promise, was beginning to reveal the shadows that had always lurked at its edges. The price of divine rule was becoming apparent. The cost of maintaining order through control was starting to manifest, and the fundamental contradictions at the heart of the Age of Fire were preparing to tear the world apart. Yet even as these dark currents began to swirl beneath the surface of divine perfection, the Silver City continued to gleam in the sunlight, its spires reaching toward the heavens like prayers that might yet be answered. As the first flame continued its inexorable decline, casting longer shadows across the realm that had basked in its light for countless centuries, the Witch of Izalith found herself consumed by a desperation that matched Gwyn's own growing alarm. She had been there at the beginning, one of the original discoverers of the Lord Souls, and her understanding of fire's nature was perhaps deeper than any other being in existence. Where others saw only the gradual dimming of light, She perceived the approaching catastrophe with a clarity that filled her with both terror and determination. The witch's domain had always been a place of warmth and nurturing flame, where her daughters tended sacred fires that burned with purposes both practical and mystical. These flames were not mere tools, but living extensions of the witch's will, each one carefully maintained and guided, according to ancient knowledge that predated even the Age of Fire. Her daughters, beings of grace and power in their own right, shared their mother's deep connection to the primal forces of combustion and creation, making their family a cornerstone of the divine order that Gwyn had established. In the depths of her flame-lit sanctuaries, surrounded by the gentle crackling of sacred fires and the soft whispers of her devoted daughters, the Witch of Izalith contemplated a solution that would either save the Age of Fire or destroy everything she held dear. If the first flame was destined to fade despite all efforts to maintain it, perhaps the answer lay not in preservation, but in recreation. Using the power of her Lord's soul, the concentrated essence of flame itself, she might be able to kindle a new first flame, one that would burn with renewed vigor and restore the failing light to its former glory. The decision to attempt this unprecedented act of creation was not made lightly. The witch understood better than anyone the delicate balance that governed the forces she sought to manipulate, knew that even the smallest error could have catastrophic consequences. But as she watched the shadows lengthen and felt the growing chill that spoke of the flame's weakness, she concluded that action, however dangerous, was preferable to passive acceptance of the coming darkness. Working in secret, hidden from even Gwyn's all-seeing gaze, the witch began the complex preparations necessary for her great work. Her daughters, loyal and trusting, assisted in gathering the materials and conducting the rituals that would focus their mother's power into a single magnificent act of creation. They brought rare minerals from deep within the earth, collected the tears of ancient spirits, and maintained the intricate patterns of flame that would serve as the foundation for the new fire. The ritual itself was a thing of terrible beauty, conducted in chambers far beneath Izalith, where the heat was so intense that the stone walls glowed like the heart of a forge. The witch stood at the center of a complex array of flames, her Lord's soul burning within her chest like a second heart, its power flowing through her body and into the carefully prepared materials that surrounded her. Her daughters formed a circle around this central fire, their own flames joining with their mother's in a symphony of light and heat that seemed capable of illuminating the entire world. For a moment, as the ritual reached its crescendo and the combined power of the witch's lineage focused on the act of creation, it seemed as though the impossible might be achieved. The flames rose higher and brighter than they had in centuries, their light pushing back the encroaching shadows and filling the underground chambers with a radiance that rivaled the first flame itself. The very air seemed to sing with power, and for one brief, shining instant, the Witch of Izalith glimpsed the salvation she sought. But the forces she had unleashed were too vast, too chaotic, too fundamentally unpredictable to be contained by even her considerable will. The attempt to recreate the first flame succeeded only in creating something entirely different, a fire that burned not with the controlled intensity of divine light, but with the wild, destructive hunger of pure chaos. This new flame did not illuminate, it consumed. It did not warm, it burned. It did not create, it transformed everything. It touched into something alien and terrible. The flame of chaos, as it came to be known, erupted from the ritual chamber with a fury that shook the very foundations of the earth. Its birth screams echoed through the underground passages of Izalith, carrying with them a heat that was beyond mere temperature, a force that changed the fundamental nature of whatever it encountered. The carefully tended fires that had been the pride of the witch's domain were instantly perverted, transformed from tools of creation into agents of destruction. The witch herself bore the brunt of this catastrophic transformation, her body caught at the epicenter of forces that no living being was meant to endure. The Lord's soul that had granted her dominion over flame became a curse as the chaos fire merged with her essence, changing her from the nurturing mother of sacred flames into something monstrous and unrecognizable. Her form, once graceful and beautiful, was twisted into a nightmare of root-like appendages and burning growths, a living manifestation of fire run mad. Her daughters, those devoted beings who had assisted in the ritual with such love and loyalty, suffered fates that were perhaps even more tragic. The chaos flame that erupted from their mother's transformation washed over them like a tide of molten madness, reshaping their bodies according to its own twisted logic. Some were transformed into creatures of web and venom, their graceful forms becoming grotesque parodies of their former beauty. Others were changed into beings of living flame and shadow, their consciousness trapped within bodies that no longer obeyed the laws of nature. One daughter managed to escape the initial transformation, fleeing from the ritual chamber as the chaos flame began its work of destruction. Kelana, whose mastery of fire had always been more subtle and refined than her sisters, recognized the danger early enough to distance herself from the catastrophe. But even her escape came at a terrible cost, for she was forced to abandon her family to their fate, carrying with her the knowledge that her flight might be seen as cowardice or betrayal. The spread of the chaos flame through the domain of Izalith created a new landscape of horror and beauty intertwined. Where once there had been chambers of gentle warmth and controlled fire, now there were caverns where molten rock flowed like water and the air itself burned with unnatural heat. The very stones were transformed, becoming organic in appearance, covered with root-like growths that pulsed with their own internal fire. This was no longer a place where mortals could tread safely. It had become a realm of pure chaos, beautiful in its alien way, but utterly hostile to normal life. From this transformed landscape, new forms of life began to emerge. The demons were born not as creatures of evil intent, but as natural expressions of the chaos flame's transformative power. They were beings of fire and fury, their bodies combining organic and mineral elements in ways that defied conventional understanding. Some took the form of massive, lumbering giants whose bodies were part flesh and part molten stone. Others appeared as swift, deadly creatures with claws of crystallized flame and eyes that burned with the light of the chaos fire itself. These demons were not inherently malevolent, but they were fundamentally incompatible with the ordered world that Gwyn had sought to create. Their very existence was an affront to the carefully maintained balance of the Age of Fire, a reminder that there were forces in the universe that could not be controlled or contained by divine will. They spread outward from the ruins of Izalith, like a plague of living flame, their passage transforming the landscape and threatening to undo centuries of careful cultivation. The creation that emerged from the witch's transformed body was the most terrible of all these new beings. The bed of chaos, as it came to be called, was no longer recognizably the nurturing mother who had once tended sacred flames with such care and wisdom. It had become a living embodiment of uncontrolled creative force, a being whose very existence generated new demons and spread the influence of chaos throughout the realm. The bed was simultaneously beautiful and horrifying, its form combining elements of plant, mineral, and flame in ways that suggested infinite possibility corrupted by absolute randomness. The tragedy of the witch's transformation lay not only in the physical horror of her fate, but in the complete inversion of her original purpose. She who had sought to preserve and nurture the light had become an agent of its destruction. The mother who had raised daughters, dedicated to the controlled use of flame, had become a source of uncontrollable chaos. The being who had worked to maintain the delicate balance of the Age of Fire had inadvertently created forces that threatened to tear that age apart. Even as the chaos spread and the demons multiplied, claiming more and more of the realm for their alien purposes, another tragedy was unfolding in distant lands. The power of the Dark Soul, long contained but never truly suppressed, was beginning to manifest in ways that the gods had not anticipated. In the ancient city of Ulasil, known for its scholarly pursuits and magical research, events were transpiring that would prove even more catastrophic than the birth of the Chaos Flame. The primordial serpent Kathy, that ancient being whose origins and motivations remained shrouded in mystery, had come to Ulasil with whispers of power and knowledge that its residents found impossible to resist. Unlike his counterpart Framt, who served Gwyn's interests and encouraged the linking of the fire, Cather was an advocate for the Dark Soul and the age of humanity that its full flowering would bring. His words were honeyed with promises of enlightenment and freedom from the constraints that the gods had placed upon mortal ambitions. Deep beneath Ulasil lay the tomb of Manus, a being known as the Primeval Man. Though whether this title referred to his place in history or his fundamental nature remained a matter of debate among the city's scholars. For centuries, this grave had remained undisturbed, its occupant resting peacefully in the depths, while the city above flourished in its pursuit of knowledge and magical understanding. But Cathy's influence and the growing instability of the Age of Fire had created conditions ripe for awakening forces that were better left sleeping. The citizens of Ulasil, driven by curiosity and the serpent's subtle manipulations, decided to disturb Manus's eternal rest. Their motivations were not malicious. They genuinely believed that they might learn something of value from examining this ancient being, perhaps gaining insights into the early history of humanity or the nature of the Dark Soul itself. They approached the tomb with the reverence due to such an ancient relic, conducting their examination with all the care and scholarly precision that their city's reputation demanded. But Manus was not merely an ancient human preserved in death. He was something far more significant and dangerous. The awakening process, conducted with such scholarly care, had an effect that none of the researchers could have anticipated. Rather than simply returning to consciousness, Manus was driven immediately and irrevocably insane, his mind shattered by the sudden transition from peaceful death to violent awakening. The Dark Soul fragment within him, freed from the constraints of peaceful slumber, exploded outward with a force that transformed him into something monstrous and unprecedented. The transformation of Manus into the Father of the Abyss was perhaps even more catastrophic than the witch's creation of the Chaos Flame. For while the chaos was alien and destructive, the Abyss was actively hostile to the very concept of order and light. Where chaos simply transformed whatever it encountered according to its own mad logic, the Abyss sought to unmake the fundamental structures that held reality together. It was not satisfied with change. It demanded complete annihilation of everything that the Age of Fire represented. The power that flowed from the maddened Manus was not like any force that the world had previously known. It was darkness given form and malicious intent. A negation of light so complete that it seemed to devour illumination itself rather than simply displacing it. The abyss that spread outward from his transformed body was not merely an absence of light, but an active presence that corrupted and twisted everything it touched, turning order into chaos and meaning into madness. Ulasil, that center of learning and magical research, became the first victim of this new horror. The city's inhabitants found themselves transformed by the abyss's influence, their human forms twisted into grotesque parodies of their former selves. Scholars became shambling monstrosities, their vast knowledge corrupted into meaningless gibberish. Mages found their carefully cultivated powers turned against them, their spells becoming sources of madness rather than wonder. The very buildings of the city began to change, their clean lines and scholarly organization giving way to impossible geometries that hurt the mind to contemplate. The spread of the abyss from Ulasil created a new kind of threat that the gods had not anticipated in their careful planning of the Age of Fire. Unlike the demons, which were at least comprehensible in their alien nature, the creatures spawned by the abyss defied all attempts at understanding or categorization. They were beings of pure malice and hunger, driven not by any recognizable motivation but by an insatiable need to spread their corruption to everything that remained untainted. News of these catastrophes reached Anor Londo through a network of messengers and magical communications that Gwyn had established to monitor the affairs of the mortal realm. The reports were initially dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings, for it seemed impossible that forces capable of threatening the divine order could have emerged so suddenly and with such devastating effect. But as more accounts arrived, each one confirming and elaborating upon the others, it became clear that the Age of Fire was facing its greatest crisis since the war against the dragons. Among the 4 knights of Gwyn, it was Artorius who first volunteered to investigate these disturbing reports and, if necessary, take action to contain the threats they described. The Abyss Walker, as he had come to be known, was renowned for his courage and his unwavering dedication to protecting the innocent from the forces of darkness. His great sword and his loyal wolf companion Sif were symbols of hope throughout the realm, and his very name was synonymous with the triumph of light over shadow. Artorius approached the growing crisis with the same methodical courage that had made him legendary in the war against the dragons. He understood that the abyss represented a fundamentally different kind of threat than any he had previously faced, but his confidence in his own abilities and his faith in the rightness of his cause convinced him that even this new darkness could be overcome through sufficient application of skill and determination. The covenant that Artorius forged with the creatures of the abyss was a desperate gambit, an attempt to gain the power necessary to face the corruption on its own terms. The ring that symbolized this agreement granted him the ability to traverse the abyss without being immediately destroyed by its influence. But it also bound him to the very forces he sought to destroy. This was a dangerous bargain, one that required him to maintain perfect control over his own nature while walking through realms where sanity itself was constantly under assault. Accompanied by Sif, his faithful wolf companion whose loyalty had never wavered through all their adventures together, Artorius descended into the corrupted depths of Ulasil. The city they found there was a nightmare of twisted architecture and impossible geometries. Its former beauty transformed into something that challenged the very concepts of space and meaning. The inhabitants they encountered were no longer human in any recognizable sense, their forms and minds corrupted by prolonged exposure to the abyss's influence. The battle that Artorius fought in the depths of the abyss was unlike any conflict that had ever been witnessed in the Age of Fire. It was not merely a contest of strength or skill, but a struggle for the very nature of reality itself. Every step forward required not just physical courage, but mental fortitude, the ability to maintain one's sense of self, while surrounded by forces that actively sought to unmake the concept of individual identity. For a time, it seemed as though Artorius might succeed where others had failed. His great sword carved through the creatures of the abyss like lightning through storm clouds, and his presence seemed to push back the encroaching darkness wherever he walked. Sif fought beside him with the fierce loyalty that had always characterized their partnership, her fangs and claws proving effective even against enemies that seemed to exist only partially in the physical realm. But the abyss was patient in its malice, and it understood that even the greatest heroes have limits to their endurance. The constant exposure to its corrupting influence began to take its toll on Artorias, wearing away at his mental defenses like water slowly eroding stone. The ring that allowed him to traverse the abyss also created a connection between his own essence and the very force he fought against, and through this connection, the darkness began to seep into his soul. The transformation of Artorias from hero to corrupted champion was gradual but inexorable. His movements became more violent and less controlled, his attacks losing the precision that had always characterized his fighting style. The great sword that had once been an extension of his noble will became a tool of mindless destruction, striking at friend and foe alike with indiscriminate fury. Most tragically of all, he began to lose the very qualities that had made him a hero: his compassion, his wisdom, and his unwavering commitment to protecting the innocent. Recognizing that his corruption was advancing beyond his ability to control, Artorias made one final, desperate gesture of heroism. Using the last remnants of his uncorrupted will, he cast a protective barrier around Sif, ensuring that his loyal companion would survive even if he himself fell to the darkness. This act of selfless love was perhaps the most heroic thing he had ever done. A moment of pure light shining through the encroaching shadow of his transformation. The fall of Artorias represented more than just the loss of a great hero. It symbolized the fundamental vulnerability of even the most noble aspects of the Age of Fire. If someone as pure and dedicated as the Abyss Walker could be corrupted by the forces arrayed against the divine order, what hope was there for lesser beings? The news of his transformation, when it eventually reached Anor Londo, sent ripples of fear and despair through the ranks of gods and mortals alike. Yet even as Artorias succumbed to the Abyss's influence, becoming a corrupted shadow of his former self, the legend of his heroism began to grow in the outside world. The full truth of what had happened in the depths of Ulasil was known to very few, and those few had reasons to keep silent about the details of the knight's fate. Instead, stories began to spread of Artorias, the Abyss Walker's great victory over the forces of darkness, tales that painted him as the savior who had single-handedly defeated Manus and saved the world from the encroaching shadow. These legends, though false in their specific details, served important purposes in the maintenance of divine order. They provided hope to those who were struggling against their own dark impulses, proof that evil could be overcome through courage and determination. They reinforced the authority of the gods by demonstrating that their champions were capable of achieving impossible victories against overwhelming odds. Most importantly, they obscured the troubling truth that the Age of Fire's greatest defender had been corrupted by the very forces he had sworn to destroy. The simultaneous catastrophes of the Chaos Flame and the Abyss marked a turning point in the Age of Fire, the moment when the fundamental instabilities that had always existed within the divine order finally manifested in ways that could not be ignored or contained. The Golden Age of Anor Londo, with its promise of eternal prosperity and divine guidance, was revealing itself to be built upon foundations that were far less stable than they had appeared. As reports of these disasters reached the Silver City, Gwyn found himself facing the greatest crisis of his long reign. The carefully constructed order that he had spent centuries building was under assault from multiple directions, and the solutions that had served him well in the past seemed inadequate to address threats of such magnitude and alien nature. The Age of Fire, which had seemed so permanent and unshakable, was beginning to show cracks that might soon widen into fractures capable of bringing down the entire structure of divine civilization. The Lord of Sunlight stood in the highest tower of Anor Londo, gazing out over the realm that had once seemed so secure under his protection, and for perhaps the first time since his victory over the dragons, he felt the weight of true despair. The demons spawning from the ruins of Izalith were spreading like wildfire across the southern reaches of his domain, their chaotic nature corrupting everything they touched and creating new problems faster than his forces could address them. The abyss that had consumed Ulasail showed no signs of containment, its dark influence seeping into neighboring lands like poison through water. Most troubling of all, the first flame continued its inexorable decline, its weakening light making all of these other problems more difficult to address. The power that Gwyn could call upon to face these mounting crises was diminishing just when he needed it most, creating a spiral of failure that seemed to have no bottom. Each day brought new reports of territories lost, populations corrupted, and loyal servants fallen to forces that defied conventional understanding or resistance. In his desperation, Gwyn made a decision that would echo through all the ages that followed. Rather than face these threats with his full power concentrated in one place, he chose to divide his Lord's soul among those he trusted most, granting them portions of his divine essence that would allow them to act as his representatives in distant corners of the realm. This strategy had the advantage of allowing multiple responses to multiple crises, but it also carried the terrible risk of weakening him beyond the point of recovery. The first fragment of his soul went to the 4 kings of New Londo, those mortal rulers who had proven their loyalty through years of faithful service to the divine order. New Londo was a magnificent city built upon the waters, its towers and bridges creating a marvel of architecture that seemed to float upon the surface of the lake like a dream made manifest. The kings who ruled this aquatic paradise were known for their wisdom and their dedication to maintaining the peace and prosperity that had characterized their realm since the early days of the Age of Fire. The gift of Gwyn's soul fragment transformed these mortal rulers into beings of tremendous power, granting them abilities that approached the divine while still maintaining their essential humanity. They could command forces beyond the understanding of ordinary mortals, their voices carrying the weight of divine authority, their presence inspiring awe and reverence in all who encountered them. With this power came the responsibility to serve as bulwarks against the spreading chaos, guardians of order in a world increasingly threatened by forces of corruption and madness. For a time, this division of power seemed to work exactly as Gwyn had hoped. The 4 kings proved themselves capable administrators of divine authority, using their enhanced abilities to strengthen New Londo's defenses and extend its influence to neighboring territories. They organized relief efforts for regions affected by the demon incursions, established new trade routes to replace those disrupted by the chaos, and maintained the kind of stable governance that allowed normal life to continue even in the midst of crisis. But the fragment of Gwyn's soul that they carried was not merely a tool or weapon. It was a piece of the divine essence itself, containing within it all the complexities and contradictions that characterize the Lord of Sunlight's nature. Along with the power to command and create, it carried the seeds of the very fears and desperations that were driving Gwyn to increasingly extreme measures. The 4 kings, elevated beyond mortality, but not beyond the reach of corruption, began to experience doubts and ambitions that their original human nature had never harbored. The primordial serpent, Kaith, that ancient advocate for the dark soul and the age of humanity, recognized in the 4 kings an opportunity that had not existed before. These newly empowered rulers possessed both the strength to make meaningful choices and the human nature that made them susceptible to arguments about the proper order of the world. Where his whispers had fallen upon deaf ears among the gods, who were too invested in the current system to consider alternatives, the 4 kings might be persuaded to see the wisdom in embracing the darkness rather than fighting it. Kaithi's approach to the 4 kings was subtle and patient, as befitted a being whose schemes operated on timescales that spanned centuries or millennia. He did not immediately suggest that they should abandon their loyalty to Gwyn or embrace the forces of darkness. Instead, he began by simply raising questions about the sustainability of the Age of Fire, pointing out the mounting evidence that the divine order was failing to address the crises that threatened to overwhelm it. The serpent's arguments were compelling precisely because they were grounded in observable reality. The demons continued to spread despite the gods' efforts to contain them. The abyss showed no signs of being defeated or even meaningfully contained. The first flame grew weaker with each passing year, and no amount of divine intervention seemed capable of reversing this decline. Perhaps, Carthy suggested, the problem was not that the gods were failing to find the right solution, but that they were trying to preserve a system that was inherently unsustainable. The alternative that the serpent presented was seductive in its simplicity and logic, rather than desperately trying to maintain an artificial age of fire that was clearly doomed to fail. Why not embrace the natural successor to that age? The dark soul, which had been suppressed and contained for so long, represented the true future of the world. Humanity, not the gods, were the inheritors of the earth, and their time had come whether the divine order chose to acknowledge it or not. The power that Cathy offered to sweeten his philosophical arguments was very real and very tempting. The art of life drain, which he taught to the four kings, was a dark mirror of the divine abilities they had received from Gwyn, where their fragment of the Lord's soul allowed them to create and preserve. Life drain allowed them to take and consume, drawing strength from other beings and adding that strength to their own. It was a power that grew stronger with use, feeding upon itself in ways that made its wielders increasingly formidable. The covenant of the Dark Wraiths that emerged from this union between the four kings and Caith's vision was unlike any organization that had existed during the Age of Fire. These were not servants or subjects in the traditional sense, but partners in a grand design that would reshape the fundamental order of existence. The Dark Wraiths were granted the ability to invade other realms, to seek out sources of humanity wherever they might be found, and to drain that essential essence for the greater purpose of bringing about the Age of Dark. From the perspective of those who remained loyal to the Age of Fire, the Dark Wraiths were nothing less than enemies of everything that made existence worthwhile. They struck without warning, appearing in peaceful communities like phantoms from nightmare. Their purpose focused solely on the consumption of human souls. They showed no mercy to the innocent, no respect for the bonds of family or friendship, no recognition of any values beyond the advancement of their dark covenant. But the Dark Wraiths themselves saw their mission very differently. They were not destroyers, but liberators, freeing humanity from the artificial constraints that the gods had placed upon their natural development. Every soul they drained brought the world one step closer to the age when humans would no longer need to live as subjects of distant divine masters. The pain and fear they caused was regrettable but necessary, the price that had to be paid for the eventual freedom of all mankind. The spread of the abyss into New Londo itself was perhaps inevitable once the four kings had embraced their new philosophy and power. The darkness that they had welcomed as an ally proved to be as uncontrollable as the chaos that had consumed Izalith, transforming their beautiful floating city into something alien and terrible. The crystal-clear waters that had once reflected the city's towers like mirrors became black as ink, hiding depths that seemed to extend far beyond what natural geography should have allowed. The citizens of New Londo, who had lived for generations under the benevolent rule of their kings, found themselves subjected to forces that they could neither understand nor resist. The life drain techniques that the Dark Wraiths practiced with such skill were turned upon the very people they had once been sworn to protect. Families were torn apart as loved ones were transformed into hollow shells, their humanity drained away to fuel the Dark Covenant's grand design. The architecture of New Londo itself began to change under the influence of the abyss, its clean lines and harmonious proportions giving way to impossible geometries that hurt the mind to contemplate. bridges that had once connected the city's districts became twisted labyrinths, where travelers could become lost for days in passages that seemed to fold back upon themselves. Buildings that had stood for centuries began to sink beneath the dark waters, their foundations eroded by forces that operated according to laws that had nothing to do with physics or engineering. As news of New Londo's transformation reached the other centers of power throughout the realm, it became clear that the crisis facing the Age of Fire had entered a new and more dangerous phase. The threats were no longer external forces that could be met with conventional military responses, but internal corruptions that struck at the very heart of the divine order. If the four kings, those trusted recipients of Gwyn's own power, could fall to darkness, then what hope was there for lesser beings to remain true to the light? The response to this latest catastrophe revealed both the nobility and the tragic limitations of the divine order's approach to crisis management. Three sealers, beings of tremendous power and unwavering dedication to the preservation of order, made the ultimate sacrifice to contain the spread of the abyss from New Londo. Their solution was as extreme as it was effective. They would flood the entire city, drowning both the corruption and the innocent lives that remained within its boundaries. The decision to flood New Londo was not made lightly or without full understanding of its implications. The sealers knew that they were condemning thousands of innocent people to death, destroying a cultural center that had taken centuries to build, and eliminating one of the Age of Fire's most beautiful achievements. But they also understood that allowing the abyss to spread unchecked would result in even greater destruction, the corruption of entire regions, and the eventual collapse of everything they had sworn to protect. The flooding itself was a marvel of magical engineering and personal sacrifice. The three sealers combined their power to redirect the natural flow of water through the region, creating artificial channels and barriers that would contain the rising flood within New Londo's boundaries while preventing it from spreading to neighboring areas. The process required each sealer to bind their own life force to the magical barriers they created, ensuring that the seals would remain strong, but also guaranteeing that they would never be able to leave their posts. As the dark waters rose through New Londo's streets and halls, they carried with them the voices of the dying and the desperate cries of those who understood too late what was happening to their city. The abyss, which had promised liberation from divine tyranny, proved to be a far more brutal master than the gods had ever been. Those who were not destroyed outright by the flood found themselves transformed into ghostly echoes of their former selves, condemned to wander the drowned ruins of their home for all eternity. The ghosts that haunted the flooded ruins of New Londo were not malevolent spirits driven by hatred or revenge, but tragic remnants of ordinary people whose lives had been cut short by forces beyond their understanding or control. They drifted through the underwater passages of their former city like living memories, their presence a constant reminder of the price that had been paid to contain the abyss's spread. Some retained enough consciousness to remember their former lives and mourn for what had been lost, while others existed as pure emotion given form, their grief and confusion made manifest in the physical world. The sacrifice of New Londo and its people served its intended purpose, creating a barrier that the abyss could not easily cross. The dark waters that covered the city acted as both prison and seal, containing the corruption within manageable boundaries while preventing it from spreading to threaten other population centers. But this victory came at a cost that weighed heavily upon the consciences of those who had ordered it, a reminder that even the most necessary actions could carry moral implications that would haunt their perpetrators for ages to come. In the aftermath of New Londo's flooding, Gwyn faced the terrible realization that his strategy of dividing his power among trusted allies had not produced the results he had hoped for. The fragment of his soul that he had granted to the four kings was now corrupted beyond redemption, its power serving the very forces he had sought to oppose. The other portions of his divine essence that he had distributed were similarly at risk, their recipients subject to the same pressures and temptations that had led to the fall of New Londo's rulers. The Lord of Sunlight's options were becoming increasingly limited, as each passing day brought new evidence of his realm's decay. The demons from Izalith continued their advance, transforming vast swaths of territory into hellish landscapes where normal life could not survive. The Abyss, though contained within New Londo's flooded ruins, had demonstrated its ability to corrupt even the most trusted servants of the Divine Order. Most ominously of all, the First Flame showed no signs of recovery, its continued decline threatening to undermine every effort at resistance or reconstruction. It was in this context of mounting desperation that Gwyn began to contemplate a solution so extreme that he had previously dismissed it as unthinkable. If the First Flame could not be restored through external means, if no amount of divine intervention could reverse its decline, perhaps the answer lay in direct sacrifice. The flame had been created through the emergence of disparity from uniformity, light from darkness, meaning from emptiness. Perhaps it could be renewed through the voluntary surrender of the very force that had defined the Age of Fire from its beginning. The decision to march upon the demons of Izalith represented both a final desperate gambit and a necessary test of the Divine Order's remaining strength. Gwyn assembled an army of his Silver Knights, those perfect warriors whose loyalty had never wavered, despite the mounting evidence of their cause's ultimate futility. These knights had stood guard over Anor Londo since the city's founding, their dedication absolute, their courage unquestionable, their faith in their Lord's righteousness complete. The army that descended into the chaotic landscape of Izalith was magnificent to behold. A river of silver and gold, flowing through the twisted corridors, where the Chaos Flame had rewritten the laws of reality. The knights moved in perfect formation despite the alien terrain, their discipline maintained through training and dedication that transcended the merely human. At their head rode Gwyn himself, the Lord of Sunlight, whose very presence seemed to push back the encroaching darkness and bring order to the chaos around him. But the forces they encountered in the depths of Izalith were unlike anything they had faced in their previous battles. The demons that emerged from the Chaos Flame were not merely powerful opponents, but embodiments of uncontrolled creative force, beings whose very existence challenged the ordered universe that the Divine Army represented. They could not be defeated through superior tactics or greater courage, for they operated according to principles that made conventional warfare meaningless. The battle that followed was less a military engagement than a collision between two incompatible visions of reality. The Silver Knights, for all their skill and dedication, found their weapons and armor inadequate against enemies that could reshape themselves at will, that could emerge from solid rock or dissolve into living flame at need. Their perfect formations became liabilities when faced with opponents that could attack from dimensions that should not have existed. One by one, Gwyn's Silver Knights fell to the demons' alien power, their gleaming armor blackened by chaos fire, their disciplined minds broken by exposure to forces that defied rational comprehension. Those who survived the initial assault found themselves transformed by the experience. Their silver armor turned to charcoal black, their once perfect loyalty corrupted by knowledge of their own fundamental inadequacy in the face of true chaos. Gwyn himself, though he possessed power far beyond that of his knights, discovered that even divine strength had limits when confronted with forces that operated outside the established order of existence. His lightning, which had once peeled the scales from ancient dragons, proved ineffective against enemies that could absorb electrical energy and transform it into new forms of chaos. His mastery of light, absolute within the framework of the Age of Fire, became meaningless when faced with darkness that was not the mere absence of illumination, but an active force of negation. The retreat from Izalith was perhaps the most humiliating defeat of Gwyn's long reign, a stark reminder that there were powers in the universe that even the Lord of Sunlight could not overcome through direct confrontation. The remnants of his once magnificent army limped back to Anor Londo as broken shadows of their former selves, their blackened armor serving as permanent reminders of their failure. The Silver Knights, who had once been symbols of divine perfection, were now walking monuments to the limitations of ordered power when faced with absolute chaos. In the aftermath of this defeat, as Gwyn surveyed the wreckage of his plans and contemplated the dwindling options available to him, the full magnitude of his situation became clear. The Age of Fire was ending whether he willed it or not, its foundations eroded by forces that he could neither defeat nor control. The careful order that he had spent millennia constructing was collapsing into chaos and darkness, and every effort to preserve it only seemed to accelerate its destruction. The decision that Gwyn made in his final extremity was born not from hope but from desperation, not from strength but from the acknowledgement of his own ultimate powerlessness. If the first flame could not be preserved through external efforts, if the Age of Fire could not be maintained through conventional means, then perhaps it could be extended through the ultimate sacrifice. He would give not just his power, but his very essence to the flame, using himself as fuel to feed the failing light and postpone the coming darkness for as long as possible. The preparations for this final act were conducted in secret, hidden from even his most trusted advisors and closest family members. Gwyn understood that if others knew of his intention, they would try to dissuade him or find alternative solutions that did not exist. The choice he was making was his alone to make, and he would not burden others with the knowledge of what was to come until it was too late for intervention. As he prepared for his journey to the kiln of the first flame, that sacred place where the original fire still burned with diminished but persistent light, Gwyn took one final look at the city he had built and the realm he had governed for so long. Anor Londo still gleamed in the sunlight, its silver spires reaching toward the heavens like prayers that might yet be answered. But he could see the shadows gathering at its edges, the signs of decay that no amount of divine intervention could indefinitely postpone. The walk to the kiln was perhaps the loneliest journey that any being had ever undertaken, for Gwyn traveled not toward victory or salvation, but toward willing self-destruction in service of an ideal that he was no longer certain could be preserved. Each step took him further from the world he had created, and closer to the moment when he would cease to exist as an individual entity, becoming instead a source of fuel for the flame that had defined his age. At the threshold of the first flame, surrounded by the ancient stone and primordial fire that had witnessed the birth of disparity itself, Gwyn made his final choice. He cast himself into the flame not as a king seeking to preserve his kingdom, but as a father hoping that his sacrifice might buy his children a few more years of life. The fire consumed his divine essence eagerly, feeding upon the concentrated power of his Lord's soul and blazing with renewed vigor. But the price of this rekindling was terrible beyond imagining. Gwyn's consciousness, instead of being extinguished by his sacrifice, became bound to the flame itself, trapped within the very force he sought to preserve. The Lord of Sunlight, who had once commanded the lightning and ruled over the greatest civilization in history, was reduced to a hollow guardian, forever bound to defend the flame that his sacrifice had renewed. He had saved the Age of Fire, but in doing so, he had also created the mechanism by which it would perpetually consume itself, demanding ever greater sacrifices to maintain its artificial existence. The moment of Gwyn's self-immolation sent ripples throughout the entire realm, as the renewed flame's power washed over lands that had grown accustomed to creeping darkness. But along with this restoration of light came something new and terrible: the undead curse. In binding his soul to the first flame, Gwyn had also bound the dark soul that resided within humanity, creating the dark sign that would mark certain humans as undead, condemned to die and return to life in an endless cycle that mirrored the flame's own artificial perpetuation. The undead curse was not a punishment, but a reflection of the fundamental contradiction that Gwyn's sacrifice had created. By forcing the Age of Fire to continue beyond its natural lifespan, he had also forced humanity to exist in a state that defied the natural order of life and death. The undead were living symbols of this disruption, beings caught between the world of the living and the realm of death, their very existence a reminder that the current order was sustained only through constant violation of natural law. As word of these changes spread throughout the realm, as the first undead began to appear and the nature of their curse became apparent, a new age of fear and persecution began. The Way of White, that religious organization that had served as a tool of divine control, now had a new purpose: the identification and containment of those marked by the dark sign. Great hunts were organized to capture the undead and transport them to special asylums where they could be contained until their inevitable descent into mindless hollowing. The Age of Fire continued, its flame burning brightly once more, but it was no longer the golden age of prosperity and divine guidance that had characterized its earlier centuries. It had become something darker and more desperate, an age sustained by sacrifice and maintained through the systematic persecution of those whose very existence challenged its legitimacy. The undead curse ensured that there would always be fuel for the flame, new sacrifices to feed its artificial hunger, but it also guaranteed that the age would never again know the peace and contentment that had once seemed its birthright. In the depths of the kiln, the hollow remnant of Gwyn continued his eternal vigil, no longer a king or a god, but a guardian whose only purpose was to defend the flame from any who might seek to extinguish it. He had achieved his goal of preserving the Age of Fire, but the cost of that preservation had transformed both himself and his realm into something that bore only a superficial resemblance to what they had once been. The light still shone, but it was no longer warm with promise. Instead, it burned with the cold fire of desperation, sustained by suffering and maintained through sacrifice. The cycles that followed Gwyn's sacrifice established a pattern that would repeat itself across the centuries, each iteration growing more desperate and more costly than the last. When the flame began to fade once more, as it inevitably did despite the Lord of Sunlight's ultimate sacrifice, new heroes would be called upon to make the same terrible choice that Gwyn had made. These Lords of Cinder, as they came to be known, would cast themselves into the dying flame to rekindle its light, perpetuating an age that was no longer capable of sustaining itself through natural means. Each linking of the fire brought its own period of renewed prosperity, its own golden age that seemed to promise that perhaps this time the light would burn forever. But each rekindling also brought new distortions to the natural order, new contradictions that would eventually manifest as fresh crises requiring ever more extreme solutions. The world grew stranger and more unstable with each artificial extension of the Age of Fire, its fundamental structures warped by the constant violation of the natural cycles that should have governed its existence. The Northern Undead Asylum stood as a monument to the uncomfortable truths that the Age of Fire's continuation required. This fortress, built on a remote island where the mainland's inhabitants would not be troubled by what it contained, served as both prison and waiting room for those marked by the dark sign. Here, the undead were brought to live out their cursed existence away from the sight of ordinary mortals, their presence no longer a reminder of the artificial nature of the current age's continuation. Within the asylum's walls, time moved differently than in the outside world. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months, months into years, and years into decades without meaningful distinction. The undead inhabitants, sustained by their curse but denied any purpose or hope, gradually lost the human qualities that had once defined them. Memory faded, emotion dulled, and eventually even the basic sense of self began to erode under the weight of purposeless eternity. Most of the asylum's residents eventually succumbed to hollowing, that final stage of the undead curse, where consciousness itself was extinguished, leaving behind only the basic animating force that kept the body moving. These hollow shells wandered the asylum's corridors like living ghosts, responding to stimuli but incapable of thought or emotion. They were not dead in any conventional sense, but neither could they be said to be truly alive, existing instead in a liminal state that defied the natural boundaries between life and death. But among the countless forgotten souls who had been condemned to this twilight existence, there was one whose fate would prove different from all the others. In a cell deep within the asylum's heart, an undead who would come to be known as the Chosen Undead had spent years in the same dreamlike state that characterized all of the asylum's inhabitants. Time had passed without meaning. Consciousness had faded to the barest flicker, and it seemed as though this individual would follow the same path to hollowing that had claimed so many others. The intervention that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Through a hole in the roof of the Chosen Undead's cell, a corpse suddenly fell, its lifeless form carrying with it a key that would unlock not just the physical barrier of the cell door, but the doorway to a destiny that would reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself. The corpse bore the armor and heraldry of a knight from a distant land, suggesting that this was no random accident but a deliberate act by someone who understood the significance of what was about to unfold. The Chosen Undead's escape from their cell marked the beginning of a transformation that went beyond mere physical liberation. As they moved through the asylum's corridors, encountering other undead and navigating the obstacles that had been placed in their path, something that had been dormant within them began to awaken. Purpose, that quality, that distinguished, meaningful existence from mere survival, began to stir in ways that the curse of undeath had not entirely extinguished. The asylum's other inhabitants responded to the Chosen Undead's newfound activity with a mixture of confusion and instinctive hostility. These hollow beings, who had long ago forgotten what it meant to have goals or desires, recognized something different about this particular individual but lacked the mental capacity to understand what that difference might mean. Their attacks were not motivated by malice but by an unconscious recognition that the Chosen Undead represented something that their own existence had lost and could never reclaim. In the depths of the asylum, the Chosen Undead encountered the knight whose corpse had provided the key to their freedom. This dying warrior, revealed through his heraldry to be a knight of Astora, had somehow maintained enough consciousness and purpose to understand the significance of the ancient prophecy that spoke of an undead chosen one. With his final breaths, he shared with the newly awakened prisoner the legend that had guided his own actions, that an undead would one day be chosen to make pilgrimage to Lordran, ring the bell of awakening, and learn the fate of all the undead. The prophecy that the knight shared was both specific and mysterious, offering clear directions for immediate action while hinting at purposes and consequences that remained hidden from immediate understanding. The Bell of Awakening, he explained, waited in the land of ancient lords, but its significance went beyond mere symbolism. Ringing the bell would set in motion events that had been prophesied since the earliest days of the undead curse, fulfilling a destiny that had been written into the very fabric of the Age of Fire's continuation. Armed with this knowledge, and driven by a sense of purpose that distinguished them from every other resident of the asylum, the chosen undead pressed deeper into the fortress's depths. Their path led them through chambers that had not been disturbed for years, past cells containing the remnants of countless other undead who had never received the spark of destiny that could awaken them from their cursed slumber. Each step forward represented a choice to embrace purpose over comfortable emptiness, to accept the burden of consciousness, rather than surrender to the peaceful oblivion of hollowing. The guardian that blocked their path to freedom was a creature that embodied both the asylum's purpose and its fundamental futility. The asylum demon, a massive being of corrupted flesh and malevolent intelligence, had been placed to ensure that none of the undead imprisoned within could escape to trouble the outside world. Its presence served as both practical barrier and symbolic representation of the forces that sought to contain the contradictions inherent in the Age of Fire's artificial continuation. The battle between the chosen undead and the asylum demon was more than just a physical confrontation. It was a test of the awakening hero's commitment to their newfound purpose. The demon's overwhelming size and strength could have easily intimidated someone who remained uncertain about their destiny, but the chosen undead fought with a determination that surprised even themselves. Each blow struck and received reinforced their understanding that they were no longer just another hollow wandering aimlessly through an eternal prison. Victory over the demon brought more than just physical freedom. It brought validation of the prophecy that had set these events in motion. From the creature's remains, the chosen undead recovered a key that was said to belong to the chosen undead pilgrim, a piece of evidence that seemed to confirm their special status among all the countless undead who had been marked by the dark sign. Whether this key had always been their destiny, or whether defeating the demon had made them worthy of it, was a question that would never receive a definitive answer. The great gate that the key opened revealed a landscape that stretched beyond the asylum's boundaries, but it also revealed the isolated nature of their former prison. The asylum stood on a rocky island, surrounded by mists and waters that seemed to extend to the horizon in every direction. There was no obvious path forward, no bridge or boat that might carry a traveler to the mainland where their prophesied destiny waited to unfold. For a moment, it seemed as though escape from the asylum had only led to a different kind of imprisonment. But the prophecy that had guided the Knight of Astora to his sacrificial mission had accounted for this apparent impossibility. As the chosen undead stood at the edge of their former prison, contemplating the seemingly insurmountable barriers that lay between them and their destiny, a shadow fell across the ground. Looking up, they saw a massive bird circling overhead, its wingspan greater than any natural creature should possess, its eyes fixed upon them with an intelligence that suggested more than mere animal instinct. The giant bird that descended to carry the chosen undead to Lordran was one of those mysteries that the Age of Fire had accumulated during its centuries of artificial continuation. Whether it was a creature transformed by the same forces that had created the undead curse, a divine messenger sent to ensure that the prophecy would be fulfilled, or simply an animal that had developed an instinctive understanding of its role in the cosmic order, none could say with certainty. What mattered was not its origin, but its function. It served as the bridge between the chosen undead's awakening and the beginning of their true quest. The flight to Lordran provided the chosen undead with their first view of the world beyond the asylum's walls. And what they saw was both beautiful and troubling. The landscape below showed the scars of centuries of conflict and supernatural upheaval. Forests had been burned and regrown in patterns that suggested unnatural influences. Rivers had changed their courses, flowing around obstacles that had not existed when the original maps were drawn. Cities and settlements dotted the terrain, but many showed signs of abandonment or decay that spoke to the instability that characterized the current age. As the great bird carried them over this transformed landscape, the the chosen undead began to understand the magnitude of the task that lay before them. This was not merely a world that needed a hero to solve a particular crisis, but a realm whose fundamental nature had been distorted by centuries of artificial preservation. The prophecy that had awakened them from their hollow slumber had not called them to a simple quest, but to a confrontation with the deepest contradictions of existence itself. The destination that the bird chose for them was Firelink Shrine, a place whose significance would become apparent only gradually as the chosen undead began to understand their role in the unfolding drama. The shrine sat at a crossroads of sorts, not just geographically but spiritually, a point where multiple paths converged, and where the complex relationships between fire, darkness, life, and death could be contemplated in relative safety. The structure itself was ancient beyond easy comprehension, its stones worn smooth by countless centuries of wind and weather, its architecture suggesting purposes that predated the current age. At its center burned a bonfire, one of those miraculous sources of comfort and restoration that had become essential to the undead's continued existence. The flame danced with a light that was both warm and mysterious, offering not just physical warmth, but a sense of peace that the chosen undead had not experienced since their transformation. Tending to this bonfire was a figure whose silence spoke more eloquently than words ever could. The firekeeper of Firelink Shrine was a woman whose tongue had been removed, whether by choice or force, leaving her unable to speak but somehow more present and attentive because of her enforced silence. Her role was to maintain the bonfire and provide whatever comfort and guidance she could to the undead who sought refuge at the shrine, her wordless compassion serving as a reminder that kindness could exist even in a world distorted by unnatural forces. The firekeeper's presence at the shrine served multiple purposes beyond the practical maintenance of the bonfire. She was both guardian and symbol, protecting the flame from those who might extinguish it, while representing the quiet heroism that characterized those who chose to serve others rather than pursue their own advancement. Her sacrifice of speech had transformed her into a kind of living prayer, her entire existence dedicated to maintaining one small point of light and warmth in a world that seemed increasingly cold and dark. The other inhabitants of Firelink Shrine provided the chosen undead with their first opportunity to interact with others who shared their cursed condition, but had found ways to maintain their sanity and purpose despite the burdens they carried. Each of these individuals had their own story of how they had come to the shrine, their own understanding of what their undead condition meant, and their own strategies for preserving their humanity in the face of forces that seemed designed to erode it. Among these fellow travelers was a warrior whose crestfallen demeanor seemed to embody the weight of knowledge that came with extended existence in the current age. This individual had been at Firelink Shrine for longer than most of the others could remember, and his understanding of the world's true condition gave his words an authority that demanded attention. When he spoke of the Bell of Awakening mentioned in the prophecy, his correction revealed that the task ahead was more complex than the Knight of Astora had suggested. The revelation that there were actually two Bells of Awakening, rather than just one, transformed the chosen undead's understanding of their quest from a simple pilgrimage to a more complex undertaking that would require them to traverse multiple dangerous territories. One bell waited above Firelink Shrine in an undead parish where the remnants of the Way of White continued their increasingly desperate attempts to maintain their faith. The other bell could be found far below the shrine, in the depths of Blighttown, where the poison and corruption that had seeped up from the demon ruins created an environment that was hostile to most forms of life. This information provided the chosen undead with a clear, immediate objective, while also hinting at the greater complexities that lay ahead. The bells were not merely symbols to be activated, but keys to understanding the true nature of the world's condition and the role that they were destined to play in its transformation. Each bell would require not just physical courage to reach, but moral courage to ring, for their activation would set in motion events whose consequences could not be foreseen or controlled. The journey to ring the first bell of awakening led the chosen undead through territories that had once been prosperous, but now showed the accumulated wear of centuries of gradual decline. The Undead Burg, which served as the approach to the Undead Parish, had once been a thriving commercial district where merchants and craftsmen had created the goods that made civilized life possible. Now it was a maze of crumbling buildings and dangerous passages where hollow undead shambled through routines that had long ago lost any meaning. The undead who inhabited these ruins were not the mindless monsters that stories often painted them to be, but individuals who had once been people with names, relationships, and dreams. Their transformation into hollow shells was not an instantaneous process, but a gradual erosion of everything that made them human, leaving behind bodies that continued to move through familiar motions long after consciousness had faded. They were tragic rather than evil, deserving of pity rather than hatred, but also dangerous in their unpredictability and their tendency to attack anything that moved differently than they did. Fighting through the Undead Burg required the chosen undead to confront not just external dangers, but internal questions about their own nature and destiny. Every hollow they encountered was a reminder of what they could become if they lost their sense of purpose or allowed despair to overcome their determination. Every victory in combat was both a step forward toward their goal and a step away from the comfortable emptiness that had once characterized their existence in the asylum. The undead parish that crowned the district's highest point retained more of its original beauty and purpose than the commercial areas below, but it too showed signs of the slow decay that characterized the Age of Fire's artificial continuation. The cathedral that dominated the parish was a masterpiece of divine architecture, its soaring spires and graceful arches designed to lift the human spirit toward contemplation of higher purposes. But the congregation that had once filled its pews had dwindled to a handful of desperate individuals whose faith was maintained more through habit than through genuine belief. The bell gargoyles that guarded the first bell of awakening were creatures that embodied the parish's complex relationship with the divine order they supposedly served. These stone guardians had been created to protect the sacred spaces of the cathedral from those who would desecrate them, but their definition of desecration had expanded over the centuries to include almost any disturbance of their eternal vigil. They attacked the chosen undead not out of malice, but from an instinctive understanding that change itself had become the enemy of the order they were bound to preserve. The battle with the bell gargoyles took place on the cathedral's highest tower, where the Bell of Awakening waited in a chamber that commanded a view of the entire surrounding region. From this vantage point, the chosen undead could see the full scope of the world they had been called to save or transform. The landscape spread out below showed the beauty that the Age of Fire had once achieved, but it also revealed the cracks and distortions that centuries of artificial preservation had created. Ringing the first bell of awakening sent vibrations through the air that seemed to carry meaning beyond mere sound. The resonant tones that emerged from the ancient bronze seemed to awaken something in the world itself, stirring forces that had been dormant and setting in motion processes that had been waiting for this precise moment to begin. The chosen undead felt the sound in their bones, in their soul, in the very essence of their being, confirming that this action was indeed a crucial step toward fulfilling their prophesied destiny. The journey to ring the second bell of awakening required the chosen undead to descend from the heights of divine aspiration to the depths where the consequences of the Age of Fire's contradictions were most apparent. The path to Blighttown led through territories that had been abandoned by the forces of order, places where the natural world was reasserting itself in ways that revealed how artificial the current age's stability truly was. The depths beneath the undead berg were a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers that had originally served as storage and maintenance areas for the district above, but centuries of neglect had transformed them into something far more sinister, a breeding ground for creatures that thrived in darkness and fed on the decay that characterized so much of the current world. The giant rats that scurried through these passages had grown to unnatural sizes, their forms distorted by the same forces that had created the undead curse. Blighttown itself was perhaps the most honest representation of what the Age of Fire's continuation had cost the world. Built in the upper reaches of the great swamp that had once been a fertile valley, the town was a ramshackle collection of wooden platforms and rope bridges that seemed to defy both gravity and common sense. The air was thick with poisonous vapors that rose from the swamp below, and the structures themselves were so unstable that a single misstep could send an unwary traveler plummeting to their death. The inhabitants of Blighttown were a mixture of outcasts, refugees, and individuals who had been transformed by prolonged exposure to the toxic environment. They had adapted to their harsh circumstances with a resourcefulness that was both admirable and disturbing, creating weapons and tools from the refuse of the upper world, while developing resistances to poisons that would kill normal humans within minutes. Their society was brutal but honest, stripped of the comfortable illusions that allowed the upper world to ignore the true costs of its continued existence. At the bottom of Blighttown's ramshackle structures lay the entrance to the Demon Ruins, where the consequences of the Witch of Izalith's failed attempt to recreate the first flame continued to manifest in forms that defied easy categorization. The second bell of awakening waited in these depths, guarded by Quelag, one of the witch's daughters who had been transformed by the chaos flame into something that was part woman and part spider. Quelag's presence at the bell represented one of the Age of Fire's most tragic ironies. She who had once been dedicated to nurturing and maintaining sacred flames had become a guardian of chaos, protecting the bell not because she understood its significance, but because her transformed nature compelled her to defend her territory against all intruders. Her battle with the chosen undead was not a confrontation between good and evil, but a collision between purpose and instinct, destiny and tragedy. The ringing of the second bell of awakening completed the first phase of the chosen undead's quest, but it also marked the beginning of a far more complex and dangerous undertaking. The two bells, ringing in harmony across the miles that separated them, created resonances that unlocked barriers and opened paths that had been sealed since the early days of the current age. Most significantly, they opened the way to Sen's fortress, that testing ground where those who claimed to be chosen would be forced to prove their worthiness through trials that went beyond mere physical courage. The opening of Sen's fortress was accompanied by changes in the world that confirmed the prophetic nature of the chosen undead's mission. Ancient mechanisms that had been dormant for centuries began to function once more. Sealed doors ground open on hinges that had not moved in living memory, and throughout the realm, those sensitive to such things felt the stirring of forces that had been waiting for this moment to awaken. As the chosen undead prepared to face the next phase of their journey, they could not have known that their simple act of ringing two bells had set in motion events that would eventually lead to a choice that would determine not just their own fate, but the destiny of the entire world. The prophecy that had awakened them from their hollow slumber had spoken truly, but it had not revealed the full magnitude of what their awakening would ultimately mean for everyone and everything that existed within the artificial construct of the Age of Fire's continuation. The cycles that followed the chosen undead's ultimate sacrifice would establish a pattern that would repeat itself across the millennia, each iteration growing more desperate and more costly than the last. The linking of the fire that the hero achieved brought about another golden age, another period of prosperity where the light burned bright and the shadows seemed to retreat to the far corners of the world. But this renewal, like all the others that had come before it, was built upon foundations that were fundamentally unstable, sustained by forces that grew weaker with each artificial extension. The world that emerged from each linking bore the accumulated scars of all the previous cycles, its fundamental structures warped by centuries of unnatural preservation. What had once been a realm where the supernatural and the mundane existed in harmonious balance became increasingly chaotic, a place where the laws of nature bent and twisted under the weight of so many violations of the cosmic order. Time itself began to behave strangely, flowing at different rates in different locations, sometimes moving backward, sometimes standing still, sometimes racing forward in ways that left entire civilizations dizzy with confusion. The heroes who answered the call to link the fire in subsequent cycles found themselves facing challenges that grew more complex and more morally ambiguous with each passing age. Where the chosen undead had faced a relatively straightforward choice between linking the fire and allowing the age to end naturally, later heroes encountered situations where the very concept of heroism had become problematic. The world no longer needed simple champions who could defeat monsters and preserve the existing order. It needed individuals capable of navigating moral landscapes that defied easy categorization. In the centuries that followed the chosen undead's sacrifice, new kingdoms rose and fell with increasing frequency, their lifespans shortened by the instability that characterized the later phases of each fire cycle. These civilizations achieved remarkable heights of art, science, and philosophy during their brief periods of prosperity, but they also developed increasingly sophisticated methods of warfare and oppression as they competed for dwindling resources and struggled to maintain order in a world that seemed determined to descend into chaos. The undead curse evolved during these cycles, becoming more widespread and more virulent as the artificial nature of the Age of Fire's continuation placed ever greater strain on the natural order. Where once only a relative few had been marked by the dark sign, entire populations began to show signs of the curse, their mortality twisted into forms that defied traditional understanding. Some undead retained their sanity for centuries, becoming repositories of knowledge and wisdom that spanned multiple ages. Others descended into hollowing within days of their transformation, their consciousness extinguished before they could fully comprehend what had happened to them. The great libraries and repositories of knowledge that had been established during the earlier, more stable periods of the Age of Fire began to reflect this increasing instability in their contents. Scrolls and books that had once contained reliable information about the world's fundamental properties now contradicted each other with increasing frequency. Maps showed territories that existed only intermittently, appearing and disappearing according to principles that no scholar could fully understand. Historical records told conflicting stories about events that should have been matters of established fact, as if the past itself had become unstable under the weight of so many temporal manipulations. Magic, which had once been a relatively predictable force governed by well-understood principles, became increasingly dangerous and unpredictable as the cycles continued. Sorcerers who attempted to use the same spells that had worked reliably for their predecessors found their magic producing unexpected and often catastrophic results. The boundaries between different schools of magical practice began to blur, creating hybrid forms of spellcasting that combined elements from multiple traditions in ways that their original creators had never intended. The gods who had once ruled from their distant thrones found themselves increasingly irrelevant to the day-to-day struggles of mortal existence. Some retreated into complete isolation, sealing themselves away in hidden sanctuaries where they could ignore the chaos that their original decisions had helped to create. Others attempted to maintain their influence through increasingly desperate and heavy-handed interventions, creating new forms of divine coercion that served only to accelerate the breakdown of the natural order they claimed to protect. Religious institutions that had once provided stability and moral guidance to their followers began to fragment into competing sects, each claiming to possess the true understanding of what the gods required from their worshippers. The Way of White, which had served as a unifying force throughout the earlier cycles, split into numerous branches, whose differences in doctrine often led to violent conflicts that further destabilized already fragile communities. The demons that had emerged from the ruins of Izalith continued to evolve and spread throughout these cycles, adapting to new environments and developing new forms that reflected the changing nature of the world they inhabited. Some learned to mimic human behavior so perfectly that they could infiltrate communities undetected, while others grew so large and powerful that they became forces of nature in their own right, capable of reshaping entire landscapes according to their alien desires. Trade routes that had once connected distant civilizations became increasingly dangerous as the cycles progressed, not just because of the monsters and bandits that plagued travelers, but because of the fundamental unreliability of geography itself. Merchants who set out on journeys that should have taken weeks sometimes found themselves arriving at their destinations years early or decades late, their cargo aged or transformed by exposure to temporal anomalies that had become commonplace throughout the realm. The concept of heroism itself began to change during these later cycles, evolving from the relatively simple ideal of courage in service of others to something far more complex and morally ambiguous. Heroes were no longer expected merely to defeat monsters and rescue the innocent. They were required to make impossible choices between competing versions of what might constitute the greater good. The clear distinctions between light and darkness, order and chaos, good and evil that had once provided moral guidance began to blur beyond recognition. Artifacts and weapons from earlier ages took on legendary status during these cycles, not just because of their inherent power, but because they represented connections to times when the world had been more stable and comprehensible. Warriors would quest for centuries to obtain weapons that had been wielded by the chosen undead or other legendary figures, believing that these tools might grant them the clarity of purpose that seemed increasingly rare in their own chaotic age. The bonfires that served as waypoints and sources of comfort for the undead began to behave erratically as the cycles continued, sometimes appearing in locations where they had never existed before, sometimes disappearing from places where they had burned for centuries. The firekeepers who tended these sacred flames found their duties becoming increasingly difficult, as the flames they served became less predictable and more demanding, requiring sacrifices that went beyond mere dedication to encompass their very identities and memories. Prophecies and legends multiplied during these cycles, each one claiming to predict the coming of a savior who would finally break the pattern of artificial continuation and either preserve the Age of Fire permanently or usher in a genuinely new age. These prophecies often contradicted each other in fundamental ways, creating confusion among those who sought to understand their destiny and leading to conflicts between different groups of believers who interpreted the same signs in radically different ways. The primordial serpents, those ancient beings whose motivations had never been fully understood, became more active during these later cycles, appearing to different individuals with advice and guidance that seemed designed to serve their own mysterious purposes rather than the good of the world as a whole. Some heroes found themselves caught between competing serpentine advisors whose counsel led in opposite directions, forcing them to make choices without any reliable guidance about which path might lead to the best outcome. Kingdoms that had once prided themselves on their military might found that traditional approaches to warfare had become obsolete in a world where the fundamental nature of reality could shift without warning. Armies that marched out to face conventional enemies sometimes found themselves battling creatures from their own nightmares, while fortifications that had withstood sieges for centuries crumbled before attacks that operated according to principles that military engineers had never encountered. The great cities that had served as centers of civilization during earlier cycles began to show signs of the accumulated strain that centuries of artificial preservation had placed upon them. Buildings that had stood since the early days of the Age of Fire developed structural problems that defied conventional engineering solutions, their foundations undermined by forces that existed partially outside normal space and time. Streets and districts that had once been perfectly familiar to their inhabitants began to rearrange themselves according to logic that no mapmaker could predict or record. Scholars and philosophers who attempted to understand the nature of these changes found themselves confronting questions that challenged the basic assumptions upon which all previous knowledge had been built. The categories and classifications that had once served to organize understanding of the world became increasingly inadequate as the boundaries between different types of existence began to blur and overlap in unprecedented ways. Artists and craftsmen who worked during these cycles produced works of unprecedented beauty and complexity, their creativity apparently enhanced by exposure to the chaotic forces that characterized their age. But these same works often contained elements that their creators had not consciously intended, patterns and meanings that emerged from the unstable environment in which they were produced, rather than from deliberate artistic choices. The natural world itself began to show signs of stress as the cycles continued, with plants and animals evolving at accelerated rates that suggested they were adapting to environmental pressures that exceeded anything in their evolutionary history. Some species developed forms and behaviors that seemed to anticipate future changes in their environment, while others appeared to be reverting to ancestral forms that had not been seen for millions of years. Weather patterns became increasingly erratic as the cycles progressed, with storms that lasted for decades, followed by periods of perfect calm that extended far beyond what natural meteorology could explain. Some regions experienced seasons that no longer followed the traditional pattern of spring, summer, autumn, and winter, instead cycling through entirely new climatic conditions that had no names in any existing language. The boundary between dreams and reality became increasingly porous during these cycles, with individuals sometimes finding that their sleeping visions had tangible effects in the waking world. Nightmares could manifest as physical threats, while prophetic dreams sometimes proved to be more reliable sources of information than direct observation of current events. Communication between distant locations became more difficult as the cycles continued, not just because of the physical dangers that plagued travelers, but because language itself began to evolve at unprecedented rates. Words and phrases that had stable meanings in one region might be completely incomprehensible in another area that was only a few days' travel away, creating barriers to understanding that had not existed in earlier, more stable periods. The great monuments and architectural achievements of previous ages began to show signs of temporal displacement during these cycles, with structures built in different time periods sometimes appearing to exist simultaneously in the same location. Visitors to these sites might encounter the same building in multiple states of construction or decay, experiencing its entire history as a layered palimpsest of different temporal moments. Marriage and family structures evolved rapidly during these cycles, as traditional social institutions proved inadequate to address the challenges of existence in an increasingly unstable world. Some communities developed entirely new forms of kinship and social organization, while others retreated into isolationist practices that sought to preserve older ways of life against the encroaching chaos. The very concept of death became problematic during these cycles, as the distinction between living and dead continued to blur under the influence of the undead curse and other supernatural forces. Some individuals discovered that they could exist in states that were neither truly alive nor properly dead, while others found that death itself had become a temporary condition that could be reversed through various means, both natural and artificial. Education and the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next became increasingly difficult as the rate of change accelerated beyond what traditional teaching methods could accommodate. Young people found that the skills and information they learned from their elders were often obsolete before they reached adulthood, while older individuals struggled to adapt to changes that occurred faster than their accumulated wisdom could process. The great libraries and centers of learning that had preserved knowledge through previous cycles began to develop their own forms of instability, with books and scrolls sometimes changing their contents without human intervention. Scholars would discover that texts they had studied for years suddenly contained entirely different information, as if the accumulated knowledge of civilization itself was becoming subject to the same temporal fluctuations that affected everything else. As the cycles continued and the strain on reality grew ever greater, it became increasingly apparent that the pattern of artificial continuation could not be maintained indefinitely. Each linking of the fire required greater sacrifices and produced shorter periods of stability, while the intervals between linkings grew longer and more chaotic. The world was approaching a crisis point where the fundamental choice between fire and darkness would have to be resolved in some final, decisive manner. The signs of this approaching culmination were visible to those who knew how to interpret them. The increasing frequency of temporal anomalies, the growing instability of basic physical laws, the proliferation of creatures and phenomena that defied all previous categories of understanding. The Age of Fire was revealing its ultimate unsustainability, preparing to either transform into something genuinely new or collapse entirely under the weight of its own contradictions. In distant corners of the realm, new forms of civilization began to experiment with alternatives to the traditional patterns of fire and darkness, light and shadow, order and chaos. These experimental communities developed technologies and social structures that attempted to transcend the ancient dichotomies that had defined all previous ages, seeking to create forms of existence that would be stable without requiring the constant sacrifice of individual lives to maintain cosmic balance. The convergence of all these trends and forces would eventually lead to the emergence of new heroes and new crises that would make the challenges faced by the chosen undead seem simple by comparison. The world was preparing for a final confrontation with its own fundamental nature, a reckoning that would determine not just the fate of the current age, but the possibility of any age that might follow it. The tolling of the bell that would herald this final crisis echoed across a world that had grown weary of its own artificial existence. This was not the gentle chiming that had once called faithful congregations to prayer, but a deep, resonant sound that seemed to emerge from the very foundations of reality itself. The bell's voice carried with it the weight of accumulated centuries, the memory of every sacrifice that had been made to preserve the Age of Fire, and the promise that these sacrifices would soon demand their final accounting. From graves scattered across the length and breadth of the realm, 4 figures stirred in response to the bell's call. These were the Lords of Cinder, heroes of previous ages who had made the ultimate sacrifice to link the fire and preserve the world from darkness. Their resurrection was not a reward for their past service, but a desperate measure, evidence that the natural cycle of heroism and sacrifice had finally broken down beyond repair. The world had exhausted its supply of willing champions, and now had to rely on conscripting those who had already given everything they had to give. Each of these lords carried with them the memory of their own linking, their own moment of choice between personal survival and cosmic responsibility. They had walked willingly into the fire, accepting annihilation as the price of the world's continued existence. And they had expected that sacrifice to be final. Their awakening in a world that had changed beyond recognition was both a violation of their earned rest and a testament to the desperateness of the current situation. Yet when the time came for them to fulfill their duty once more, to return to the thrones that awaited them and combine their power in one final linking of the fire, 3 of the 4 lords refused. This refusal was not born from cowardice or selfishness, but from a hard-won understanding of what their previous sacrifice had actually accomplished. They had seen the world they saved continue to deteriorate despite their efforts, had watched new generations of heroes make the same choice they had made only to face the same ultimate futility. The only lord who answered the call and returned to his throne was Ludleth of Courland, a figure so small and seemingly insignificant that many questioned how he could have possessed the power necessary to link the fire in his own time. But Ludleth's diminutive stature concealed a will of iron and an understanding of sacrifice that transcended mere physical capability. He had linked the fire not through overwhelming strength, but through absolute commitment to the ideal that the world's existence was worth any personal cost. The 3 lords who refused to return presented the world with a crisis unlike any it had faced before. Aldrich, Saint of the Deep, had been a holy man whose devotion to helping others had gradually transformed into something darker and more consuming. His sainthood had been built upon acts of charity and compassion, but his understanding of love had evolved to encompass a desire to preserve others by literally consuming them, incorporating their essence into his own being, so that they might achieve a form of immortality through union with him. Yorm the Giant represented the tragedy of good intentions carried to their logical extreme. His decision to link the fire had been motivated not by abstract duty, but by concrete love for his people and his realm. But the very act that he had hoped would preserve his kingdom had instead consumed it, transforming his beloved subjects into the very things he had sought to protect them from. The fire he had fed with his own life had burned away everything he held dear, leaving him with the bitter knowledge that his sacrifice had been not just futile but actively destructive. The Abyss Watchers embodied a different kind of tragedy, one born from the corrupted legacy of great heroes. They had modelled themselves on Artorias, that legendary knight whose fall to darkness had been concealed behind stories of triumph and glory. The Watchers had bound themselves together with wolf's blood, creating a collective identity that was supposed to make them stronger and more resilient than any individual warrior. But this binding had also made them vulnerable to collective corruption, and when darkness finally touched one of their number, it spread through the entire organization like a plague. The failure of these lords to return to their duty meant that the fire would continue to fade without the infusion of power necessary to sustain it. But rather than accept the natural conclusion of this process, the world's remaining powers enacted one final, desperate measure. The unkindled were awakened. Beings who had once attempted to link the fire, but had lacked the strength necessary to complete the task. These failed heroes had been reduced to ash by their inadequacy, but that same failure had also preserved them from complete annihilation, leaving them available for resurrection when more qualified champions proved unwilling to serve. Among these awakened unkindled was one who would become known as the Ashen One, an individual whose previous failure had taught them lessons that success never could have provided. Their resurrection in the cemetery of Ash, that place where the unsuccessful were laid to rest, marked not just the beginning of a new quest, but the commencement of a fundamentally different approach to the ancient problems that had plagued the world for so long. The cemetery of Ash existed in a state of perpetual twilight, neither fully claimed by darkness nor properly illuminated by light. Here, among the weathered headstones and crumbling monuments to forgotten heroes, the Ashen One experienced their second birth into a world that had grown strange beyond recognition. The very air seemed thick with the residue of countless failed attempts at heroism, the accumulated disappointment of those who had tried and found themselves wanting. The first challenge that faced the newly awakened Ashen One was Iodex Gundyr, a figure whose role was to test the worthiness of those who claimed to be chosen. This was not the relatively straightforward trial that previous heroes had faced, but something far more complex and morally ambiguous. Gundyr had once been a champion himself, arriving at his moment of destiny only to find that he was too late, that another had already made the sacrifice he had prepared himself to make. His transformation from hero to guardian, from savior to gatekeeper, reflected the world's increasing tendency to corrupt even the most noble intentions. The battle with Gundyr was as much a philosophical confrontation as a physical one. The Ashen One was forced to prove not just their combat prowess, but their commitment to a course of action whose ultimate purpose remained unclear even to those who demanded its completion. Victory over Gundyr represented not the triumph of good over evil, but the successful navigation of a moral landscape where traditional categories of right and wrong had lost their meaning. The Firelink shrine that awaited the Ashen One beyond Gundyr's trial was both familiar and alien, a reflection of the original sanctuary that had sheltered previous heroes but transformed by centuries of accumulated strangeness. The firekeeper who tended the central bonfire was blind, her sight sacrificed in service of her duty, but her blindness had granted her forms of perception that normal vision could never provide. She could see the flow of souls through the world, could perceive the connections that linked all living things, could sense the approaching conclusion of the great cycle that had defined existence for so long. The shrine served as a gathering place for individuals who represented different aspects of the world's current condition. Each resident had their own story of how they had come to this place, their own understanding of what the Ashen One's mission might mean, their own hopes and fears about what the future might bring. Some clung to traditional beliefs about the necessity of linking the fire, while others had begun to question whether perpetuating the current system was truly the best available option. The lands that the Ashen One would traverse in their quest to return the Lords of Cinder to their thrones represented a world in the final stages of collapse. The High Wall of Lothric, that massive fortification that protected the kingdom's capital, showed signs of architectural impossibility that defied conventional engineering. Towers twisted in directions that hurt the mind to contemplate. Bridges spanned distances that seemed to vary, depending on the observer's perspective, and the very stones seemed to shift and change when no one was looking directly at them. The kingdom of Lothric itself had been built around a single, consuming obsession, the creation of a perfect heir to the flame, a being whose very existence would solve the problem of the fire's inevitable fading. Generations of rulers had dedicated their resources and their sanity to this goal, using methods that grew increasingly desperate and morally questionable as conventional approaches proved insufficient. The royal bloodline had been manipulated through magical and alchemical means, its members bred like livestock in pursuit of characteristics that might prove suitable for the ultimate sacrifice. Prince Lothric, the culmination of this centuries-long breeding program, possessed all the qualities that his ancestors had sought to create in their ideal heir. He had the power necessary to link the fire, the bloodline that connected him to the original lords, and the education that should have prepared him for his destiny. But he also had something that the program's designers had not anticipated: the wisdom to recognize that the entire enterprise was built upon fundamentally flawed assumptions. The prince's refusal to link the fire was not an act of cowardice or selfishness, but a reasoned rejection of a system that had proven itself incapable of producing lasting solutions to the problems it claimed to address. He had studied the histories of previous linkings, had observed the diminishing returns that each sacrifice produced, and had concluded that the time had come to allow the natural cycle to reach its conclusion, rather than perpetuating an artificial state that grew more costly and less effective with each iteration. His brother Lorien, the elder prince who had been expected to serve as Lothric's protector and guide, had been transformed by his own experiences into something that was no longer entirely human. His body bore the marks of battles fought against demons. His soul carried the weight of victories that had cost more than they had gained, and his mind struggled to process the knowledge that everything he had sacrificed his health and humanity to protect was ultimately doomed to fail regardless of his efforts. The Ashen One's journey to retrieve the absent Lords of Cinder led them through territories that represented different aspects of the world's final crisis. Each location told its own story of how the artificial prolongation of the Age of Fire had distorted the natural order beyond recognition, creating environments where the familiar categories of life and death, order and chaos, meaning and absurdity had become hopelessly intermingled. The Cathedral of the Deep, where they sought Aldrich, had once been a center of healing and spiritual guidance. Now, it was a grotesque parody of its former purpose, its halls filled with clerics whose devotion had transformed into something monstrous and consuming. The deep waters that had once been used for purification rituals had become breeding grounds for creatures that existed in the spaces between different states of being, neither fully alive nor properly dead. Farronkeep, the stronghold of the Abyss Watchers, showed what happened when noble ideals were pursued without regard for their ultimate consequences. The Watchers had dedicated themselves so completely to their mission of preventing the spread of darkness that they had become indistinguishable from the forces they fought against. Their endless warfare had transformed their sanctuary into a poisonous wasteland where nothing could grow or flourish. The profaned capital, Yorm's domain, demonstrated the ultimate futility of trying to preserve something by destroying it. The giant's attempt to protect his people through linking the fire had resulted in their complete annihilation, leaving him alone among the ruins of everything he had sought to save. The city's architecture had been twisted by the same flames that were supposed to preserve it, creating structures that defied rational comprehension while serving no useful purpose. The Ashen One's encounters with each of these fallen lords forced them to confront questions about the nature of duty, sacrifice, and the proper response to seemingly impossible choices. Each lord had been a hero in their own time, had made decisions based on the best information available to them, had sacrificed everything in service of ideals they believed to be worthy. Their current states were not evidence of their moral failure, but testimony to the inadequacy of the system within which they had been forced to operate. The battles that the Ashen One fought to compel the Lord's return to their thrones were tragedies rather than triumphs, necessary acts of violence against beings who had already given more than should have been asked of anyone. Victory in these encounters provided no satisfaction, only the grim knowledge that the cycle of sacrifice and futility was being perpetuated once more. Yet even as the Ashen One succeeded in returning the lords to their thrones, even as the possibility of one final linking of the fire came within reach, new revelations continued to emerge that called the entire enterprise into question. The discovery of the true nature of Firelink Shrine, the revelation of the Firekeeper's hidden knowledge, and the growing understanding of what the world's condition truly represented, all pointed toward the conclusion that the traditional solutions were no longer adequate to address the magnitude of the crisis. The painted worlds that existed within this reality offered a glimpse of alternative possibilities, places where different rules applied and different outcomes might be achieved. These realms, created through art and sustained by belief, demonstrated that the dichotomy between fire and darkness was not the only possible framework for existence. They suggested that new forms of reality might be created by those with sufficient imagination and determination. The Ashen One's ultimate confrontation with the soul of Cinder, that amalgamation of all previous lords who had linked the fire, represented not just a battle between individuals, but a conflict between different visions of what existence should mean. The soul of Cinder embodied the accumulated weight of every sacrifice that had been made to preserve the Age of Fire, while the Ashen One represented the possibility that these sacrifices might finally be allowed to achieve their ultimate purpose through the acceptance of ending rather than its indefinite postponement. But before this final confrontation could take place, before the ultimate choice between fire and darkness could be made, the Ashen One would be drawn into revelations that transformed their understanding of the world's true condition. The painted world of Ariandel, accessible through a scrap of canvas touched by trembling fingers, opened doorways to possibilities that existed beyond the ancient dichotomy that had defined all previous ages. Within this painted realm, where reality was subject to the artist's vision rather than the rigid laws that governed the outside world, the Ashen One encountered beings who had chosen exile over participation in the endless cycle of sacrifice and renewal. These inhabitants of the painted world had found ways to exist outside the framework that demanded constant choice between fire and darkness, creating their own forms of meaning in a realm where different rules applied. The painted world's beauty lay not in its perfection, but in its acceptance of impermanence and change. Unlike the outside world, which had grown stagnant through its desperate attempts to preserve a single moment of glory, the painted world embraced the natural cycles of growth, decay, and renewal. When rot began to set in, threatening the realm's continued existence, its inhabitants understood that this was not a catastrophe to be prevented, but a natural transition that would make way for something new and beautiful. At the heart of this painted realm's philosophy was an old man named Guile, a figure whose devotion transcended the narrow categories that had defined loyalty in the outside world. His dedication was not to abstract principles or distant gods, but to a single individual, a young painter whose art had the power to create new worlds from the ashes of old ones. Guile's love for his lady was pure in its simplicity, unmarked by the complex political considerations that had corrupted so many other relationships in the dying age. The painter herself represented a new form of creative power, one that did not require the destruction of existing beauty to make way for fresh possibilities. Her art was not parasitic but generative, drawing its strength from sources that renewed themselves rather than depleting finite resources. She possessed the ability to create entire worlds through her paintings, but she lacked one crucial element necessary to complete her greatest work: pigment, made from the dark soul itself. Gale's quest to obtain this pigment led him on a journey that would take him beyond the painted world and into the very heart of the mystery that surrounded humanity's ultimate destiny. His search carried him to the Dreg Heap, that place where all the failed kingdoms and abandoned dreams of the Age of Fire had come to rest. Here, in this landscape built from the accumulated refuse of centuries, the true cost of the world's artificial preservation became visible in ways that no amount of philosophical argument could have made clear. The Dreg Heap was not merely a dumping ground, but a revelation of the hidden violence that had sustained the Age of Fire's continuation. Every beautiful city, every magnificent kingdom, every golden age of prosperity had been built upon foundations of sacrifice and suffering that had been carefully hidden from view. The heap contained the remains of all those who had been deemed expendable in the pursuit of preserving the light. Their stories erased from official histories, but preserved in the physical reality of their discarded remains. Moving through this landscape of accumulated loss, The Ashen One began to understand that the choice they faced was not merely between linking the fire or allowing it to die, but between perpetuating a system built upon hidden violence or accepting responsibility for creating something genuinely new. The traditional options offered by previous heroes were revealed to be false alternatives, both serving to preserve the fundamental structures that had created the current crisis. The journey through the Dreg Heap led to the Ringed City, that ancient prison disguised as a gift where Gwyn had confined humanity's dark power at the world's end. This city, with its impossible architecture and temporal distortions, existed as both monument and warning, demonstrating what happened when power was exercised without wisdom and when fear was allowed to drive policy decisions that would echo through the ages. The Ringed City's inhabitants were the descendants of those who had been exiled for possessing the power that the gods feared but could not destroy. They had lived for centuries in their beautiful prison, maintaining their dignity and culture despite the restrictions placed upon them. But their exile had also preserved them from the corruption and decay that had consumed so much of the outside world, making them repositories of knowledge and wisdom that had been lost elsewhere. In the depths of the Ringed City, the Ashen One encountered Filianor, daughter of Gwyn, whose eternal slumber served as the seal that maintained the separation between the world of light and the realm of dark. Her sacrifice was both more complete and more tragic than her father's, for where Gwyn had at least achieved the glory of martyrdom, Filianor had been condemned to an existence that was neither life nor death, neither meaningful action nor peaceful rest. The moment when the Ashen One touched the egg that Filianor guarded marked a turning point in the world's history, the breaking of a seal that had been maintained since the earliest days of the Age of Fire. The flash of light that accompanied this action was not destruction but revelation, stripping away the illusions that had hidden the world's true condition and exposing the reality that had been carefully concealed behind layers of comforting deception. What the breaking of the seal revealed was a world that had already ended, a landscape of ash and sand where the remnants of all previous ages lay buried beneath the weight of accumulated time. The sun had become a hollow shell, its light failing as the fire that sustained it finally exhausted the last of its artificial fuel. This was not a catastrophe that might be prevented, but a conclusion that had already been reached, hidden from view only by the power of Filianor's sacrifice. In this wasteland of endings, the Ashen One finally encountered Gale in his transformed state, no longer the devoted servant who had sought pigment for his lady's painting, but a creature consumed by the very power he had hoped to obtain for her use. The dark soul that he had sought to gather had driven him to madness, transforming his pure devotion into something monstrous and unrecognizable. The battle with Gale was perhaps the most tragic confrontation in the entire saga, a conflict between two beings who shared the same ultimate goal, but had been forced by circumstances beyond their control to become enemies. Gale's transformation was not a result of moral failure, but of the impossible burden that had been placed upon him. The requirement that he sacrifice everything he was in order to obtain what his lady needed. Yet even in his madness, even in his monstrous form, Gale retained enough of his original purpose to recognize what the Ashen One represented. His final act was not one of malice but of completion, ensuring that the blood of the dark soul that he had gathered through such terrible cost would not be wasted, but would serve its intended purpose. His death was simultaneously an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of his own story and the commencement of the next phase of existence. The blood of the dark soul that the Ashen One recovered from Gale's remains was more than mere pigment. It was the concentrated essence of humanity's potential, freed from the constraints that had limited its expression for so long. This substance represented not just the power to create new worlds, but the wisdom to create them well, informed by the accumulated experience of all who had suffered and struggled throughout the Age of Fire's long decline. Returning to the painted world with this precious cargo, the Ashen One found the young painter ready to begin her greatest work. The new world that she would create would not be a mere repetition of what had come before, but something genuinely novel, a realm that learned from the mistakes of previous ages while embracing possibilities that had never been explored. Her promise that this new world would be cold, dark, and very gentle carried within it a vision of existence that transcended the violent dichotomies that had defined all previous forms of civilization. The painted world's approach to renewal offered a model for how endings could serve as beginnings rather than simply as terminations. Instead of desperately trying to preserve what was dying, the painter and her realm embraced the natural cycles of existence while ensuring that the wisdom gained through experience would not be lost. The new world would be different from the old, but it would also be better, informed by understanding rather than driven by fear. This revelation of alternative possibilities cast the Ashen One's final choice in a new light. The traditional option of linking the fire was revealed to be not just futile but actively harmful, perpetuating a system that had already exhausted its potential for positive change. The alternative of simply allowing the fire to die was shown to be incomplete, failing to take responsibility for ensuring that what came next would be better than what had come before. The true choice that faced the Ashen One was more complex and more hopeful than previous heroes had been offered. They could choose to become the architect of transition rather than simply its agent, taking active responsibility for shaping what would emerge from the ashes of the old age, rather than merely determining which form of ending would be permitted to occur. The final confrontation in the kiln of the first flame took place in a space that had been transformed by centuries of sacrifice and artificial preservation. The soul of cinder that guarded the dying flame was not truly an enemy, but a manifestation of the world's own reluctance to let go of familiar patterns, even when those patterns had become destructive. The battle was as much with the Ashen One's own conditioning as with any external opponent. Victory over the soul of cinder opened the way to choices that had never been available to previous heroes. The Ashen One could link the fire as so many others had done before them, perpetuating the cycle for a few more centuries or millennia. They could allow the fire to die and usher in an age of dark whose nature remained unknown and unknowable. But they could also choose a path that had only become possible through the knowledge gained from Gale's sacrifice and the painter's vision. The Firekeeper's eyes, those organs of sight that had been forbidden to her kind, offered the Ashen One a glimpse of what lay beyond the traditional alternatives. With these eyes, she could see not just the immediate consequences of different choices, but the long-term patterns that stretched across multiple ages and cycles. Her vision revealed that the apparent opposition between fire and dark was itself a false construction, a limitation that had been imposed upon reality rather than discovered within it. The possibility of ending the Age of Fire without simply replacing it with an Age of Dark represented a fundamental breakthrough in the world's understanding of its own nature. This third option required not just the courage to reject familiar patterns, but the wisdom to envision genuinely new possibilities and the skill to nurture those possibilities into existence. The choice that the Ashen One ultimately made would determine not just their own fate, but the entire trajectory of existence itself. Unlike previous heroes who had been forced to choose between predetermined alternatives, the Ashen One possessed the power to create new options through their actions. Their decision would be truly free in ways that no choice had been free since the earliest days of the Age of Ancients. The ending of the fire's artificial prolongation did not result in the catastrophic return to the grey world that had been feared for so long. Instead, it created space for new forms of existence to emerge, realities that combined the best aspects of light and darkness, while avoiding the destructive extremes of both. The world that emerged from this transition was neither the golden paradise promised by the Age of Fire, nor the terrifying void threatened by the Age of Dark, but something richer and more complex than either alternative could have provided. In this new reality, the painted worlds served as seeds from which fresh possibilities could grow. The young painter's creation became the template for numerous other realms, each one exploring different aspects of what existence might become when freed from the constraints of ancient fears and outdated certainties. These worlds were connected but not identical, diverse but not conflicting, offering their inhabitants choices that had never before been available. The gentle darkness of the painter's world proved to be not the absence of light, but its transformation into something more subtle and nurturing. This was a darkness that welcomed rather than excluded, that nurtured growth rather than preventing it, that offered rest without demanding the surrender of consciousness or purpose. It represented the possibility of peace that came not from the defeat of opposition, but from the integration of apparent contradictions into more complex and satisfying forms of harmony. The eternal cycle that had defined existence for countless millennia finally revealed its true nature as the Ashen One's choices rippled through the fabric of reality itself. What had seemed like an inescapable pattern of rise and fall, light and shadow, sacrifice and renewal, was shown to be merely one possible arrangement among many. The cycle had persisted not because it was necessary, but because it was familiar, maintained by the collective inability to imagine alternatives rather than by any fundamental law of existence. Time itself, that force which had become so distorted during the later phases of the Age of Fire, began to flow in new patterns that reflected the liberation from ancient constraints. Instead of the linear progression that had characterized the age of gods and heroes, or the circular repetition that had trapped the world in endless cycles of linking and fading, time became something more like a spiral, carrying the best of what had been forward into new configurations, while allowing the destructive patterns to dissolve into memory. The painted worlds multiplied and diversified, each one exploring different aspects of what existence might become when freed from the limitations that had once seemed absolute. Some were realms of pure contemplation, where consciousness could explore its own nature without the distraction of physical needs or external pressures. Others were worlds of endless creativity, where the boundary between thought and reality was so thin that imagination could reshape the environment through sheer force of vision. There were painted worlds that existed primarily as gardens, places where the natural order was allowed to develop according to its own logic, rather than being forced to conform to the needs of civilization. In these realms, forests grew in patterns that revealed mathematical principles too complex for conscious understanding, while rivers carved channels that followed the hidden geometries of beauty itself. The creatures that inhabited these worlds were neither tame nor wild, but something entirely new, beings whose existence demonstrated possibilities that had never been explored. Other painted worlds served as libraries, not just of books and scrolls, but of experiences themselves. Here, the accumulated wisdom of all previous ages was preserved not as dead information, but as living understanding that could be accessed by those who sought to learn from the past without being trapped by it. The mistakes that had led to the Age of Fire's ultimate failure were catalogued and studied, not with the goal of assigning blame, but with the intention of ensuring that similar patterns would not emerge in the new configurations of existence. The most remarkable painted worlds were those that existed specifically as bridges between different forms of reality. These liminal spaces allowed beings from various realms to meet and exchange ideas without the conflicts that had characterized interactions during the Age of Rigid Categories. Here, creatures of fire could commune with beings of darkness, gods could learn from mortals, and the artificial distinctions that had caused so much suffering could be transcended through mutual understanding and respect. The role of consciousness itself was transformed in these new realities. Instead of being trapped within individual bodies and minds, awareness became something more fluid and interconnected. Beings could choose to share their consciousness with others, creating collective intelligences that preserved individual identity, while enabling forms of cooperation and empathy that had been impossible under the old arrangements. Privacy and solitude remained available to those who desired them, but isolation was no longer the default condition of existence. Death, that force which had been so feared and problematized during the Age of Fire, regained its natural function as a transition rather than a termination. In the Painted Worlds, death became something gentle and meaningful, a graduation from one form of existence to another rather than a catastrophic ending that had to be prevented at all costs. The undead curse that had plagued humanity for so long simply dissolved, its purpose fulfilled and its artificial constraints no longer necessary. The gods who had once ruled from their distant thrones found themselves faced with a choice that paralleled the one that had confronted the Ashen One. They could attempt to maintain their traditional authority in realms where hierarchy had become obsolete, or they could embrace transformation and discover new forms of existence that utilized their power in service of genuine flourishing rather than mere preservation. Many chose transformation, finding that their divine nature was enhanced rather than diminished by voluntary participation in the new order. Those gods who chose to resist the changes found that their power was not stripped from them but simply rendered irrelevant by the shift in consciousness that the new realities enabled. Their lightning and fire, their authority and judgment, remained potent within the contexts where such forces served constructive purposes, but lost their grip over beings who had outgrown the need for external control and direction. The primordial serpents, those mysterious figures whose machinations had shaped so much of the Age of Fire's history, finally revealed their true purpose. They had not been servants of fire or darkness, but agents of transition itself, working across vast spans of time to prepare consciousness for the moment when it would be ready to transcend the limitations that had once seemed absolute. Their apparent opposition to each other had been a kind of performance, designed to ensure that all possibilities were explored before the final transformation began. Frampt and Carthy, no longer needed as separate advocates for fire and darkness, merged back into their original unity, becoming guides who could help other beings navigate the transition from limited existence to expanded awareness. Their serpentine forms were revealed to be temporary adaptations, shapes chosen for their symbolic value, rather than expressions of their true nature. In the new realities, they appeared as they truly were, ancient consciousnesses whose wisdom spanned the entire history of existence, and whose purpose was to nurture the growth of awareness itself. The landscapes of the Painted Worlds reflected the consciousness of their inhabitants in ways that had been impossible during the Age of Fire's rigid structures. Cities grew organically from the desires and dreams of their residents, their architecture shifting to accommodate new needs and aspirations without the violence of demolition and reconstruction. Mountains and valleys formed according to the emotional and spiritual needs of those who dwelt among them, creating environments that were both beautiful and functional in ways that purely physical planning could never achieve. Weather in these realms became an expression of collective mood and intention rather than a force to be endured or controlled. Rain fell when communities desired the gentle melancholy that comes with soft precipitation, while sunshine emerged when celebration and joy called for bright illumination. Storms arose only when their dramatic power was needed for inspiration or catharsis, and they passed quickly when their purpose had been fulfilled. The artistic traditions that developed in the Painted Worlds transcended the limitations that had constrained creativity during previous ages. Music became a form of architecture, with compositions that shaped physical space according to their harmonic structures. Poetry evolved into a kind of magic that could alter reality through the precise arrangement of words and meanings. Visual art achieved the power to create new realms simply through the act of observation. As viewers became collaborators in the creative process, rather than passive consumers of predetermined imagery, education in these realms took forms that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. Knowledge was transmitted not through arduous study but through direct experience, as learners could temporarily inhabit the perspectives of masters and understand complex ideas through immediate participation rather than abstract explanation. The artificial separation between teacher and student dissolved as beings recognized that everyone had something valuable to contribute to the collective understanding. The concept of work itself was transformed as the painted worlds eliminated the scarcity that had made labor necessary for survival. Instead of toiling to meet basic needs, beings could engage in activities that expressed their deepest nature and contributed to the collective flourishing of their communities. The distinction between work and play became meaningless, as all activity was motivated by joy and purpose rather than external compulsion. Relationships in the painted worlds reflected the new understanding of consciousness as fundamentally interconnected rather than isolated. Love became a form of shared existence rather than mere emotional attachment, while friendship evolved into genuine unity that preserved the uniqueness of each individual while creating bonds stronger than any that had existed under the old arrangements. Families formed based on spiritual affinity rather than mere biological connection, creating kinship networks that spanned multiple realms and forms of existence. The painted worlds demonstrated that the apparent conflict between individual freedom and collective harmony was another false dichotomy that had limited earlier forms of civilization. In these new realities, the more fully individuals expressed their authentic nature, the more they contributed to the well-being of their communities. Selfishness became impossible because the self was understood to include rather than exclude other forms of consciousness. Technology, in the painted worlds, evolved beyond the crude manipulation of matter that had characterized earlier ages. Instead of building machines that operated according to mechanical principles, the inhabitants of these realms learned to work directly with the fundamental forces of creation itself. Their tools were extensions of consciousness rather than separate objects, responding to intention and awareness rather than mere physical manipulation. The healing arts reached new levels of sophistication as practitioners learned to address not just physical symptoms but the underlying patterns of consciousness that gave rise to illness and suffering. Disease became rare not because it was prevented by external intervention, but because the conditions that created it no longer existed in realms where consciousness and environment were aligned in harmony. The exploration of these new realities revealed that existence itself was far more malleable and responsive to conscious intention than had ever been imagined during the Age of Fire. The physical laws that had seemed absolute were shown to be merely local preferences, arrangements that could be modified or transcended when the beings who lived within them developed sufficient understanding and cooperation. Communication between the painted worlds took forms that made the crude methods of the previous age seem like primitive scratching in dirt. Messages could be transmitted instantaneously across vast distances through the shared consciousness that connected all realms, while complex ideas and emotions could be conveyed with perfect fidelity through forms of expression that utilized all possible modes of perception simultaneously. The painted worlds proved that the dream of paradise that had motivated so many of the Age of Fire's misguided efforts was not impossible, merely misunderstood. Paradise was not a perfect place that could be achieved through the right combination of power and control, but an ongoing process of conscious participation in the creative forces of existence itself. It could not be built or conquered, but only grown through the patient cultivation of awareness and compassion. As more beings awakened to the possibilities that the painted worlds represented, the transformation accelerated beyond anything that could have been predicted. What had begun as a few isolated experiments in alternative existence became a vast network of interconnected realms, each one contributing its unique perspective to an ever-expanding understanding of what consciousness could achieve when freed from the limitations of fear and separation. The gentle darkness that the young painter had promised proved to be not just an aesthetic choice, but a fundamental principle of the new existence. This darkness was the fertile void from which all possibilities emerged, the receptive space that welcomed new forms of light and life without demanding that they conform to predetermined patterns. It was darkness as creative potential rather than destructive negation, shadow as the complement to light rather than its enemy. The Age of Fire, with all its glory and tragedy, was finally allowed to achieve its true purpose, not through endless preservation, but through willing transformation. The sacrifices that had been made, the suffering that had been endured, the wisdom that had been gained through countless cycles of struggle and growth, all found their fulfillment in the emergence of forms of existence that honored the best of what had been while embracing the infinite possibilities of what could be. The painted worlds became seeds that would continue to multiply and diversify throughout eternity, each one exploring new aspects of the inexhaustible potential that consciousness possessed when it was free to express its authentic nature. The cold, dark, gentle place that the painter had envisioned expanded into countless realms of wonder and beauty, all connected by the understanding that existence itself was an art form in which every being could participate as both creator and creation. In this new configuration of reality, the ancient question of whether fire or darkness would ultimately prevail was revealed to have been meaningless from the beginning. Both fire and darkness, along with all other apparent opposites, were shown to be aspects of a more fundamental unity that transcended all categories and limitations. The true victory was not the triumph of one force over another, but the recognition that all forces were expressions of the single, inexhaustible creativity that was the source and essence of existence itself. And so our journey through the ages draws to its gentle conclusion, like the soft fading of embers in a hearth that no longer needs to burn with desperate intensity to ward off the darkness. We have walked together through the rise and fall of mighty kingdoms, witnessed the birth of gods and their eventual transformation, and seen how even the most carefully constructed orders must eventually give way to new forms of beauty and meaning. The tale we have shared is ultimately a story about the courage to let go, to allow what has served its purpose to end gracefully, so that something better might begin. From the grey world of ancient dragons to the painted realms of infinite possibility, we have traced the long arc of consciousness learning to understand its own creative nature. The heroes we encountered, from the chosen undead to the Ashen One, were not ultimately fighting to preserve any particular arrangement of reality, but to create conditions where genuine choice could finally become possible. Perhaps the most beautiful truth revealed through this long saga is that even our deepest struggles serve a purpose beyond our immediate understanding. The firekeepers who tended their lonely flames throughout the darkest periods found their devotion had prepared them perfectly for nurturing new forms of light. The undead who wandered hollow through endless centuries discovered their experience of existing between life and death had taught them to navigate the fluid boundaries of transformed existence. The painted worlds that emerged from all this struggle represent something that had never existed before, realities created through love rather than fear, sustained by joy rather than desperation, guided by wisdom rather than mere power. These gentle, dark places are not empty voids, but fertile spaces where consciousness can finally express its authentic nature without conflict or contradiction. As you drift towards sleep, dear traveler, carry with you the knowledge that transformation is always possible, that endings are beginnings in disguise, and that the gentle darkness holds infinite potential for new forms of light. Rest now in the understanding that your own journey, with all its challenges and discoveries, is part of a larger story still being written in the space between sleeping and waking, where all painted worlds begin.